Hi, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Meat Medic podcast. Now, today I've got returning guest Bradley Marshall with me today. Hello, Bradley. Thank you for joining us again today.
Hey, Dr. Suresh. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, no, absolutely. The pleasure's all mine. Thank you for coming back on the show. Today's show is a little bit different. We're going to do something a little bit different that we haven't done before on the Meat Medic podcast. Bradley's actually asked me to effectively give him a consultation with his blood tests. Which I've agreed to do. So APRA and Australian registers that Bradley has agreed to put this out there. He's consented.
100% consent.
He's consented to putting his information out there. So I'm not breaking any confidentiality laws because Bradley's allowed this. Before we get into the episode though, guys, I just want to tell you about all the exciting things happening over at themeatmedic.com. I have relaunched the website, themeatmedic.com, with our brand new site and brand new community features, as well as new guides and new courses. Make sure you check out the website at themeatmedic.com and sign up free for our community. If you want to take your health to the next level, though, we do have paid membership options available with access to a private podcast with myself, exclusive live Q&A every single week. And if you really want to take it to the next level, you can sign up for our gold tier with free, unlimited access to all courses and all products available on themeatmedic.com. Thank you, guys, and we'll get back to the episode. So, Bradley, why was it that you contacted me and wanted to get these blood tests done?
Well, most people out there who are following me, know my story that I had eczema and I healed myself through a carnivore diet. So the reason why I want to get my blood tests done is because I'm diverging away from the carnivore diet. I've since reintroduced fruit. So the first time we talked, I was just eating meat still, and a few avocados and coconuts on the side, but really 95% of the time, just meat. But these days, I actually eat quite a lot of fruit. And the reason why I reintroduced fruit is the same reasons Paul Saladino reintroduced fruit. And that's because I was getting electrolyte deficiencies. I was getting intense cramps and it was quite debilitating. Like, I remember working out and this cramp was just so bulging that it looked like a hernia sticking out. And I was really concerned. And it was very painful, of course, too. And it was continuous. It wasn't like once or twice. It was every single time, like maybe 3 times a month, I'd be doing sit-ups and I'd be really wary because I knew if I contorted my abs in a certain position, it would cramp up again. And I never had issues like this in my whole life. So I looked it up and Paul Saladino said he had the exact same issues. So it seemed very obvious to me that I needed to change something in my diet. And I can discuss this further as well because Professor Bart Kay talks about Paul Saladino shouldn't have reintroduced fruit. He should have just kept eating more meat because you can get glucose from gluconeogenesis. And the fact is, I was eating like 8 steaks a day and I was completely full. Like I couldn't eat anymore. And not only was it expensive, but I just literally couldn't eat anymore and I was still getting the cramps. So I just don't see, and his criticism of Paul Saladino, Dr. Bart Kay's criticism, was that Paul Saladino was eating too much organ meats. And I wasn't even eating as much organ meats. So I'm not sure exactly how you're supposed to rectify that, especially for me, since I'm not eating butter, eggs, cream, cheese. So purely because they inflame me. So anyway, I reintroduced fruit, and that's why I'd love to see if I'm healthy in this blood test. And you haven't actually told me anything prior to this this interview, so I'm hearing it for the first time, which is great. And but yeah, I'm interested because I'm not following a traditional carnivore path, and I'm obviously not following the standard American diet path. This is like Paul Saladino's pathway. And so, yeah, we talked in our last podcast about how hemoglobin A1C is normal for Paul Saladino, and yet we have people like Dr. Sean Baker and Dr. Ken Berry who have troubling higher levels of hemoglobin A1C. And we talked about how the possible pathways of the reasons why that's occurring with the whole Randall cycle, and how if you're eating excessive fat, then you're blockading essentially the glucose, which is from entering the cell, which means the glucose is just floating around your bloodstream. And then that's causing the diabetes or higher levels, pre-diabetes.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, that's why I want to get my blood test done.
Yeah,
essentially.
So, yes, I haven't given you any information. You sent me your bloods about a week ago. I've been having a look through them. I've been tight-lipped. I haven't given you any information. So you're hearing it for the first time. This isn't live, so you'll hear it before the listeners. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Obviously, I came on your podcast, and that's going to be hopefully out fairly soon. Yeah, we spoke quite a lot actually about this kind of the HbA1c in particular, and how a lot of carnivores say that, yes, it just goes up on carnivore because, well, carnivore. And it's like, I don't really buy that myself personally. There's nothing that's that special about the carnivore diet that should just kind of magically raise HbA1c by itself, where we don't see that on, for example, keto or low carb diets. And I know some people talk about things like reticulocytes going up. I mean, I haven't particularly seen that, though reticulocytes are not a standard test on an Australian full blood count. Back in England, yeah, it was a standard test on the blood counts, but not here in Australia. So I haven't been able to really track that for people, for my patients. But I don't really buy this HbA1c just goes up because of carnivore, because there's really no evidence to support that. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, if HbA1c is going up, if red blood cells longer, that shouldn't really have any real significant impact, because you can only get glycated once. So living longer doesn't really mean more glycation, or it shouldn't really mean more glycation. Plus, HbA1c is primarily really the last kind of 5, maybe 6 weeks. Although it's 3 to 4 months, the average lifespan of a red blood cell basically is 3 to 4 months, but it's kind of geared towards the last maybe 5 to 6 weeks. And even people like Judy Cho mentions this in her videos, that, you shouldn't kind of rely on it as a test, because it is geared towards the last 5 weeks. But then she kind of also ignores just like a slightly high HbA1c and says, oh, well, fine, move on, no problem, which I have a little bit of an issue with, because I think there may be missing something there is my point. And I don't think we can just say, well, yeah, raised HbA1c is perfectly fine. We'll come to your HbA1c later. I won't give any spoilers. But yeah,
I'm so intrigued.
Basically, I mean, the long and short of it is this whole thing is it's complicated.
Yeah.
Why these things happen. HbA1c goes up on carnivore. Look, I don't know. I am not a world international expert. Maybe people like Ben Bickman, if I can ever get him on the show, he might talk about it. But I don't think anyone really knows is the answer. But I certainly have my theories as to why, and it may be in part at least down to the Randall cycle. So anyway, so you were basically doing pretty strict carnivore. Last we spoke, you were doing relatively strict carnivore, other than basically some avocados and coconuts, or maybe a little bit of something else. But you weren't doing animal-based back then. But then you started to notice issues with the diet and with cramps and some other issues that Dr. Paul Saladino mentioned. What kind of time period did that happen for you? Because it has been a little while since we spoke. You were one of my very early guests on the show, and it's been about a year, I think, since we spoke.
Yeah, I remember there's like last year when I was around August, I was in the Philippines, and this was before I started eating a lot of fruit, because I went to the Philippines and there was not much meat available to just freely eat, because in the Philippines it's always hot and humid, and everyone eats fish and fruit. And there's meat, like there's pig, roast pig, and there's meat from fish. But like in terms of red meat, it's there, but it's harder to obtain really, because everyone's just eating fish and fruit, and rice. So at that point, I was getting a lot of cramps when I was working out. I remember when I was in the Philippines, I was doing sit-ups and I had this massive cramp where I had to sit down for like 15 minutes to half an hour just to recover from it. And I remember deciding then that I would start reintroducing a lot of fruit. And that's really when I started massively introducing fruit. I was in the Philippines and there was a lot of fruit available, all organic and pesticide free. It was just everywhere, naturally growing. So of course I just felt like this is the perfect time to start experimenting. And that's when I really started adopting an animal-based diet. And since then I eat a lot of fruit. But prior to that, I had cramps while I was on a carnivore diet, but it was increasing with time. It was getting worse and worse. At the start, it was manageable. And I guess the longer I stayed on carnivore, the more electrolyte deficient I was. And the more these cramps just came up. And it wasn't like I could survive, but it was just, at one point I just thought like it was a hernia. I was convinced it was a hernia. And the doctor said, look, we'll get an ultrasound. No, it's fine. It's not a hernia. It's just a cramp. I'm like, well, this is very serious then, because it was sticking out. Like it looked like my intestines were sticking out. That's how bad the cramp was.
Gosh, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's roughly the timeline. So I started the carnivore diet around a lion diet, 2022, June 22nd. That's the date I started. And 3 months I was on a lion diet before I reintroduced some coconuts and avocados because I was starting to notice these electrolyte deficiencies. At one point in my journey, I had edema, swelling in my feet. And this was while I was still sick, but it was relatively healing at that point. And I remember talking to a doctor and he suggesting that it could have possibly been salt consumption, like too much salt, and that I needed to balance it with potassium. So it may have been electrolyte deficiencies. That's why I reintroduced coconuts and avocado, because I realized that Michaela Peterson, who is on the lion diet, is supplementing with calcium, magnesium, potassium. So I really wanted to not use synthetic supplements. I wanted to use organic sources. So that's why I chose to implement coconut and avocado, purely because they're on the keto diet. So they're low carb already. And that was fine. And that reduced the level of these cramps. And I was satisfied for that period of time, which was a year of just 99% of the time on a lion diet, coconut and avocado, and sometimes raw honey in that year. And then come the Philippines. So June 22nd, 2022 to 2023, in around August, I went to the Philippines. That's when I really started an animal-based diet. So I was like on a lion diet-ish for a year.
Yeah, about a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is not entirely dissimilar to what I've spoke about, maybe that kind of 9-month, 12-month mark. Paul Saladino, relatively similar as well. Interesting. I mean, you mentioned Bart K, and this is a common thing with the carnivore community is, I'll just eat more fat, eat more fat, whatever the problem is, just eat more fat.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I mean, look, potassium, there's a lot of potassium in bacon, so eat more bacon maybe. Though I have concerns around the linoleic acid, level.
Grains and soy.
So
the pigs are fed as well.
I mean, very interesting. I mean, I did a consult recently with someone who is following a carnivore-ish, type of diet, more like a ketovore, not an animal-based, but a ketovore diet. And like I've spoke about with other people, her LDL subfractions actually was getting slightly worse. And we I mean, throwing it backwards and forwards, like what's kind of the cause here? Because diet seemed pretty much perfect. She's exercising really well, looking after herself, stress is way down, like sleep's improved, everything. And the only thing that we can really come up with is that she was mainly eating chicken and pork, which both accumulate linoleic acid, and eating very little ruminant animal, beef, lamb, and like no goat or anything. So that's kind of the only thing that we could come up with, that maybe that was causing some issues there. And, she's going to then flip that around and then do it again in say 6 months and see if she then improves. So I do have, I have some concerns around bacon, albeit it's very nice to eat.
And I'm sure you'll reveal this in time, but were you able to determine my LDL subfractions from?
No.
Or no? Okay.
No. So we can't do the LDL subfractions from that. That's like a direct, kind of calculation basically from the lab. It's what we can do, and we will do that. And you've just reminded me, I did mean to do that, and I haven't actually done that, is we can work out your remnant cholesterol. So remnant cholesterol is a little bit different. LDL subfraction is kind of like, I suppose, if you will, the gold standard. And that's where you're actually measuring what your LDL is actually made of. So you're looking at LDL 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And let me see if I can actually bring up a a sample report actually from someone like Nutripath, and I'll see if I can put it on the screen here actually to share. Should be able to. Yeah, there we go. So this is from Nutripath. This is the company, one of the companies that I use here in Australia. And this is an LDL subfraction report. So it tells you all your total cholesterol, triglycerides, and so on. Of course, that's this kind of bit is on like a standard panel, basically, like LDL, HDL, triglycerides, cholesterol. But then it goes into, obviously it gives you the triglyceride HDL ratio. You can obviously work that one out yourself anyway. This one also includes lipoprotein little a, which is a useful test as a one-off, may not be super useful longer term to repeatedly check it. It's LP little a is like a carrier for oxidized LDL. And if your LP little a is really high, that is known to be associated with quite an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. LP little a, you can get tested independently for about $50, at least last time I checked. Here in Australia, of course, other countries may be a little bit different. This full LDL subfraction, typically, this one from Nutripath is about $185. Through things like Sullivan Nicoled's QML here in Australia, they're about $125 roughly. But you don't get the LP little a with that as well. And that's another $50 on top. So it's about the same price all in. But yeah, you get things like the VLDL, which you don't get on a standard test. And then you get all of the breakdown of the LDLs, IDLs, LDL 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So it's basically the higher this number, the worse it is. So LDL 7 is worse than 6, worse than 5, 4, and so on. Pretty much everyone has, LDL 1 and 2. That's pretty normal. And LDL 3 plus is where we start to talk about this small, dense LDL. Or this oxidized LDL. And you also get the particle size, which is also independently associated with, lower particle size, increased risk of cardiovascular disease as well. So the LDL subfraction is kind of like the gold standard, if you will. But a remnant cholesterol is very well correlated also with cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. Way better than LDL. LDL cholesterol is like, yes, there's an association, but the association is so weak that it's almost not worth worrying about. I mean, officially, the guidelines here in Australia and across the world, we should worry about LDL, but the association is so weak, it's almost laughable. And I know people like Sean Baker have done tests, check the cholesterol and then go and work out and check it again, and it's like doubled. Or was it half? I can't remember which way it went for him. And it's like making a mockery almost of like, what's the point in doing this test that's so variable that you can double it in like 5 minutes? It's just crazy. But a remnant cholesterol is very strongly associated, not causative still, but very strongly associated. And to do that, we look at the total cholesterol minus the HDL minus the LDL. And the idea there is you're really measuring all the like triglycerides, chylomicrons, VLDL, like all of these kind of higher risk markers, which is again going to give you a much better association with those risk factors than just an LDL or total cholesterol, for example. So
the context of this is in our last interview, I asked you to give me a list of everything I need to check. And it was a very thorough and extensive list, which I'm very grateful for. So I sent that list to a doctor, and it was just a general doctor. And he was very obliging in the sense that he did quite a few of them, but in the same sense, he was like, this is very unnecessary. I'm not sure why you're asking me to do all of this. I mean, you're 27 years old. I mean, because I didn't tell him that I was on the carnivore diet as well. He was just saying, why are you so concerned? I mean, you're 27 years old. You want to get all of this checked?
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why I check those things is because I think they're all independently very important. I'm actually surprised they checked as much as they did, honestly.
Yeah.
So, I thought they were just going to like send you away and say, God, no, go away, go and see whoever wanted these tests, go and see them.
Yeah.
Because a lot of doctors, they'll just refuse to request these because they don't understand the benefit. They don't understand the importance and the benefit of trying to be, actively being healthy. Anyway, we've probably spoken a little bit enough about backstory. Now we're on to almost 20 minutes. Let's get into your bloods then, Bradley, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, for sure. I'm
So
excited.
I've got them up here. Let's go right back to the top. So yes, I mean this doctor that you saw. Hang on, let me get my thing here. There we go.
Hope there's enough information there to
There's
see a
quite a
picture.
bit. There's quite a bit, and actually that is a really important point. So seeing a picture, and I was going to talk about that at the end, but let's talk about it now as you've used those words. That is a really important point because individually, and this is what people like Sean Baker, Ken Berry, Chafee, whatever, like they all kind of talk about this, and in this sense, they are correct. Using a one singular result as a marker of health is pretty silly, to be honest. Even things like a fasting insulin, and we'll talk about yours later anyway. Even a fasting insulin by itself is a poor marker because, you know, some people like, you know, think Sean Baker's fasting insulin was like 2 or 3, you know, and he's saying, okay, that's amazing. That means it's healthy. Paul Saladino talks a lot about fasting insulin. His is, I think, 2 or 3 as well. And yeah, that's generally very good. You know, I've got diabetic patients with a fasting insulin of 3.
Mm.
Are they healthy? Like, well, no, because they've got diabetes. They're very insulin resistant, but they've got a fasting insulin of 3. Now, the body's actually producing insulin, but there's just something going on with it, that maybe this insulin suppression or whatever it is, it's still not working properly. So just one singular marker is not a great way to judge someone's health. So building a picture is, I think, really important. And I think we've got enough here to build a picture.
Okay, that's
basically. Good. So we'll go through those. All right, let's just go through them. So obviously I mentioned off air anyway, but I've blanked out all your details, and no one can find your address or anything to come and find you. So all right, so you obviously had these done about a month ago. We've got some previous results actually. So 2014, you also had some done through this lab.
Yeah, I sent you a previous test as well. I'm not sure if you got that one.
Oh, I haven't actually seen that. Not sure where we were, guys. We kind of edited that little bit out, and there might be a bit of a jump there, but Bradley just sent me his previous results actually, which I hadn't received from him. So we've gone through those so we can make a little bit of a comparison there. So Brad had some bloods done back in 2022.
Yeah.
So kind of, yeah, pretty much near the start of Carnivore, because you started in June, didn't you? You said
June 2022.
Yeah. So now these are not in the same order, so we might have to do a little bit of jiggery pokery. Let's have a little look. Have we got a folate? Oh, I don't have a folate. Okay. So the first one here is the vitamin B12 and the folate. So obviously latest here, April 24, 11, 14, quite a while ago, of course. But your folate, your B12 is basically fine. I mean, optimum range is probably 400 plus. Active B12 would be a useful one, though I don't usually overly worry about active B12. And the serum folate, 24.2. Folate's an interesting one. I've spoken about folate a little bit on my channel. I like to pair folate with a homocysteine level, which was in the list of things I sent you, but obviously the doctor decided not to do that. The reason I check it with a homocysteine, and homocysteine is a protein in the body which is produced as part of this methylation pathway, this folate cycle pathway, and people may know it as part of things like MTHFR, gene mutations, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, and basically, if your homocysteine is elevated, it kind of tells your body it isn't particularly happy. Something's going on. It doesn't tell you what, but it can tell you that your body's not overly happy if it's a bit elevated. Ideal Australian units would be less than 9 for homocysteine. We don't have that level here, unfortunately. But the reason I like to pair it with a homocysteine is because when you're like getting like a 54, like this previously back in 2014, you're going to be absolutely fine. Of course, that's basically very, very high folate levels. And some people argue about folate excess. I'm not sure that's really a thing that we need to worry about too much for most people. When you're getting into this level, though, 24.2, some people can have issues at 24.2. And the homocysteine can actually start to go up, and maybe around 30 to 35 nanomoles per liter. These are Australian units. May be preferable for some people. For some people, though, I mean, I had one recently. Homocysteine was I think 5.4, and their folate was like 9.6, something like that. So their body's perfectly happy with this lower folate level. But I've seen some people, even around this 24, maybe the homocysteine can just go up slightly, and then bumping that folate up can bring that homocysteine actually back down a little bit. So unfortunately, we don't have that homocysteine here, but 24.2 is pretty reasonable.
Is that so? That's low, is it? 24.2?
It's not low. What I talk about is like a functional level, quote unquote. I'm doing air quotes for people who are listening in the car. I can't really overly tell you if this folate's normal. It's within the normal ranges, but I can't tell you if it's optimal for your body without that homocysteine level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So should it be above 54? Is that?
No. So the previous one, 2014, was above 54. So that was like 10 years ago, obviously. That's just where it was. And the reference range is above 9. But again, reference ranges are for average population. Average population is generally unhealthy. So we don't really want to be using reference ranges. We want to be using optimal ranges, which are not really published. And that's just something you learn with time and experience and research and so on. So optimum range for folate can be anything from maybe about 10 to 40, honestly. But it does depend on this like homocysteine. And if that's elevated and your folate's a little bit low, if the folate comes up, homocysteine goes down, your body wanted a higher folate level. If it doesn't really change, your body was happy.
So in 2014, when it was above 54, that's above, you're suggesting the limit that it should be at 40. That's also unhealthy?
Possibly. Some people do think that excess folate can cause problems, which may stand to reason because excess vitamins can cause issues. Folate is vitamin B9. Yeah, I mean, excess vitamins can cause issues. It's very rarely seen, I have to say, outside of like vitamin C infusions and stuff like that people do, but it's very rarely seen. But there are papers out there talking about vitamin B9, folate excess causing some issues. I don't think I've ever seen it, to be perfectly honest, but
2014, I was 18 and I was eating a lot of broccoli.
Yeah. Broccoli is very high in folate. So avocado is very high in folate as well. Cruciferous vegetables, brassicas, like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. These things are pretty high in folate. Eggs, of course, very high in folate. About 20 micrograms of per egg on average, but it probably does vary between brands, free range, organic, etc. Eggs are quite variable. That's the downside of eggs. Avocado is quite high. Lettuce is reasonable. Cos lettuce, romaine lettuce being higher than iceberg. Lettuce at around 40 odd micrograms per 100. I think avocado is something like 88 maybe per 100 grams. RDA for folate is around 300 or so. And I know people like Dr. Anthony Chaffee talks about RDAs being basically useless, but I don't think they are, because I think if you, let me put it this way. I think if you're going to say that something's useless, you've got to present an alternative. And no one, as far as I know, is presenting an alternative value system. So I think RDAs are kind of the only thing we have to go on. An RDA for folate, I think, just with my internal testing myself with patients and so on, I think it's reasonable. So around 300 micrograms a day. So folate, eggs about 20. Liver, off the top of my head, I'd have to double check, but I think it's about 100 micrograms per 100 grams of liver. So for an RDA of 300, you'd need 300 grams of liver. I believe that's correct off the top of my head. It's a lot of liver. No one's eating 300 grams of liver a day. You'd probably get vitamin A toxicity from that. So maybe Paul Saladino's eating like half an ounce a day. I eat probably average about half an ounce a day, maybe at most. So liver is not one you can just rely on either. Chicken heart's super high in folate. Again, about a gram per microgram. So 100 micrograms is about 100 grams of chicken heart. For some reason, chicken heart specifically, not beef heart, not lamb heart, chicken heart specifically. Maybe it's the stuff they're fed. I don't know, grains and soy. I don't really know. So that is a concern with chicken. But chicken heart, you're not going to overdose on chicken heart. Not really any vitamin A in that. Really good for vitamin B2, riboflavin, which we haven't had checked here. I very rarely check because no one's ever vitamin B2 deficient, riboflavin. But riboflavin, interestingly, can provide almost like like a bypass almost for this MTHFR folate pathway. And that may be why some people who have a low folate still have a perfectly normal homocysteine level, because they're getting a lot of vitamin B2 maybe in their diet. Vitamin B2, really high in things like heart, lamb's heart, super high in vitamin B2. Milk, pretty high in vitamin B2. Raw milk is probably going to be very high in vitamin B2, I'm sure, just like any other milk. And this may help to actually mitigate some of the issues with, borderline low folate. But we don't know if you've got a low folate because we don't have that homocysteine level.
Yeah.
This is reasonable. I mean, 24.2, I wouldn't be crying about this level. Quickly. It's
Maybe
generally fine.
some things to be aware as well is during 2014, I was obviously on all of those steroids, and I was when I'm between 18 and 23, it was like a period where I was relatively healthier than I was in my childhood, because I think that's like the peak age. And so a lot of those symptoms decreased. But having said that, I was still on steroids, and I always tended to have a high level of AST, ALT. I remember the doctors always talking about my liver function, and I have this deficiency called G6PD deficiency, which
you mentioned that last time we spoke, I believe.
Yeah, which many people in Asia and especially the Philippines have, as I believe it makes me potentially immune to dengue or like a variation of malaria.
I must admit, I'm not an expert on G6PD. I've never
Okay.
been it. It's one of those things you read about in textbooks, you learn in medical school, and just like instantly forget. You just
Yeah,
have no
yeah.
idea.
It's like a genetic mutation because there's a lot of dengue, well, like malaria variation, I guess, in the Philippines, and so the blood cells actually recycle or die faster than the actual dengue or malaria virus can actually replicate. And so that's the advantage of having G6PD, but it also means you can't tolerate fava beans and legumes. And that runs in my genetic history. So, and not just mine, my uncle's too. Like when he eats legumes, his fingers all become stiff and his joints become stiff. And so it's definitely a genetic thing. And probably plays into the reason why I struggle with vegetables so bad, like brassicas, because of all of those glucosinolates and sulfur I'm highly allergic to. Yeah.
I'll maybe stay away from those then and stay to the avocados, perhaps. Yeah. Going back to your bloods. So yeah, folate, we've had a chat about that. I mean, this level generally is fine. I really wouldn't worry too much about this one. Ferritin. So, I mean, ideally, I'd like to have like the full iron studies. So the iron, total iron binding capacity, transferrin saturation, and the ferritin here. But a lot of the time, doctors here in Australia, they just request the ferritin because Medicare can get a little bit funny about doing too many tests. So that's why people get a bit funny about it. Ferritin of 287, reference range being 30 to 320 here in Australia for this lab. 287 is probably fine. It's probably fine. It's difficult to make any real determination from this without the full iron studies. Because for some people, 287 will be perfect. For some, it will be a bit too high. And they actually might potentially be slightly overloaded on that, even though it's not actually technically high according to the reference range. And I know people like Paul Saladino has mentioned this quite a number of times in his podcast. He feels better when his ferritin's lower. And he's now aiming for, I think, like 50 to 75, which is like almost borderline iron deficient. So I'm not sure why he's pushing so low with that. But he's just experimenting on himself and finding what works for him at the end of the day.
Is that his ambition or is that what he has?
No, I think, he's trying to push it down because he does venous sections. He just like takes blood off and he says he puts it in the pot plant next to his desk. It's a really good, blood is a really good fertilizer.
Yeah.
It's a really good fertilizer. But yeah, he's actually taking it off and discarding it because when you do that, your body then produces more red blood cells. Your iron actually goes down to produce these red blood cells. And so ferritin will then drop. Ferritin's like your iron store, basically. But yeah, he argues that he feels better on a lower ferritin. Some people certainly do. But usually you'd see like a transferrin saturation being a bit elevated if that's the case. So if your transferrin saturation was perfectly normal, then the likelihood is that this ferritin is not an issue. It's probably not a huge problem anyway. Raised ferritin can make people feel fatigued and tired sometimes. It can cause issues with the liver as well. And we certainly see this in hemochromatosis, which is this genetic predisposition for getting a buildup of iron. And there's different types of hemochromatosis genes, H63D, C282Y, and then, how many genes are affected, 1 copy, 2 copies, etc. At this level, you probably don't have hemochromatosis. I think if you were eating this much meat and you had hemochromatosis, you probably would be having a slightly raised ferritin. It may not necessarily be excessive, but yeah, you'd probably have slightly elevated over that reference range, like 345, 350, 360, something like that.
Apologies. So what's hemochromatosis again?
Sorry. So hemochromatosis is this genetic, change, basically a gene mutation in genes that code for basically like iron metabolism, part of the iron metabolism. And when you have hemochromatosis, you have this genetic susceptibility to overloading iron and building it up and having this excess kind of storage, which can then cause
like hemoglobin.
Yeah, basically. And you're building up this excessive iron, level. Heme comes from, basically hemoglobin comes from iron, basically, not blood itself. But basically, so hemochromatosis is this kind of can lead to this buildup of iron, which for some people can reach, this ferritin can go to thousands and then can become actually very damaging. Unless you're into that thousands, most people don't have any massive problem. It's not really damaging them. But even, I've seen certainly 500-600 and they're really fatigued and tired and just feeling really run down and just really under the weather, really very much the same as very low iron, just fatigued and tired mentally, just not quite with it, not alert, not sharp, that kind of thing. And what's very interesting with mineral excess, vitamin excess, as well as vitamin deficiency, they're often very much the same symptoms, which is really fascinating. Just as an aside, but yeah, you get this H63D, C282Y. These are the genes that can be affected. I mean, you don't necessarily need to know that because it's unlikely you've got hemochromatosis, but I'd like to ideally see this ferritin maybe a little bit lower. For some people, optimum ranges might be somewhere between, say, 150 and 200. I don't know if the G6PD would be affecting this. I'd have to double check that. Like I said, I'm not an expert on G6PD. I've never seen it in my clinical career, so it's not something I know very much about.
On the G6PD point, on the previous blood test I sent you, which was around last year, 2022 at the end of December, the AST and ALT levels were higher. Both of them were elevated, but now my AST and ALT is, I think my AST, one of them is actually lower and within range.
Yeah, you're jumping the gun a little bit, but yeah.
Sorry. but
yes, they have improved.
I always thought that is possibly related to my G6PD because they were always elevated even before, like on a standard American diet. They were always elevated and it was always something my doctor brought up. So
it probably is. I mean, this was obviously 2022 and yes, the ALT was elevated back then in 2022. AST was elevated slightly at 36. Optimum ranges for ALT, AST, gamma GT down here as well. Again, these are, units per liter, Australian units. I think Americans use the same, I think. Generally, optimum would be less than 25 for pretty much these three. ALP generally is higher anyway, so less than 25 will be abnormal for that. But ALT, AST, gamma GT, less than 25 is probably the optimal. These reference ranges, again, these are fine, but they're a little bit high for my liking, especially ALT. If it's above 25, there's a reasonable chance you could have some issues with your liver. So I tend to go on optimal ranges, with patients. But on the whole, this ferritin is not a big problem. I'm not overly concerned with it. I'd like to see the full iron studies. It's unlikely you've got hemochromatosis. But ferritin's also an acute phase reactant, which means it's an inflammatory marker. So that can also push up ferritin. And that's why I don't like using ferritin as a single standalone marker, because if your CRP is elevated, and we'll come to yours in a moment, if you're inflamed, the ferritin can go up anyway. And so I don't think it's that good of a marker of iron by itself. Because if you say you've got a ferritin of, say, 50, but you're inflamed, you don't know if that ferritin's actually normal or if it's realistically actually, say, like 20, and you're actually iron deficient. So I don't like using ferritin by itself as an independent marker. I like doing that full iron studies. I think there's benefit in that. But yeah, a lot of doctors just don't request that, unfortunately.
Well, I'm definitely interested in doing that in the future.
Yeah. Okay, moving down to your testosterone. Now, I have to ask you, because lower down, there's a fasting glucose that says it was tested around 10:45 a.m. Do you know, was that when you had your blood test done? In the morning?
Yeah, it was around 10:45. Yeah.
Okay, I figured it probably would have been. So, optimum time for checking testosterone is between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m.
Okay.
Because it does go through variations through the day, and it tends to peak in the morning and then drops down. So if it's checked after 10 a.m., then it will probably look lower than it actually is.
Okay.
Okay, so bear that
So
in
this
mind.
is considering, so this 14.8 looks relatively low, I'm guessing.
Not overly. So if you had this checked to, say, 8 a.m., it probably would look higher. So
Yeah.
that's something that you could do, is get it rechecked. And there will be variation day to day anyway. We'll talk about testosterone and how it varies, but you could get it rechecked at some point around maybe 8 to 9 a.m. But then it's not always easy to make a comparison.
Mm.
So if we want a true comparison, you should get it checked at the same time each time. But
Yeah.
ideal time
Good
to check
advice.
is between 8 a.m. and probably 8 to 9, but they say 8 till 10. I generally check mine around 8 a.m. Because that's when it's typically highest. That's when I start work. There's a lab next door to me. I just go and get my bloods, and so it's easy timing for me. So let's bear that in mind, that this is probably looking a little bit lower than it actually is, because it was checked a little bit later on in the day. Total testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, and free testosterone. So testosterone, like many hormones, has to be free to be really active. And so the free testosterone is actually really important here, not necessarily the total testosterone. The total testosterone here, 14.8. Now, Americans are going to be looking at this going, oh my God, this guy's like dying.
Really?
we use different units. We use nanomoles per liter. Americans use milligrams per deciliter. And they're very, very different units. The approximate, because Americans like to talk about this 1,000, this magical 1,000 that they're all aiming for. They're talking about the total testosterone, which arguably isn't actually that useful anyway compared to the free testosterone. That usually equates to around about maybe 28, 30, 35, perhaps, off the top of my head, in terms of the
Well, there's
nanomoles per
35
liter.
in the range there on the right, so
Yeah.
probably
So
35.
that's that 1,000, like that magical 1,000, which hardly anyone ever gets to anyway. But that's the total testosterone. The free testosterone is really actually the more important part. And we use slightly different, we use picomoles per liter. I think they use nanomoles per liter in America. I'm not sure off the top of my head. So again, these numbers are going to sound a bit weird to Americans listening to the show and watching the show. So your calculated free testosterone is 309, reference range being 225 to 725. But bearing in mind, this was checked after the optimal time. So the reality is yours are probably actually slightly higher, potentially up to 50%, if not more. Actually,
Wow.
they should be kind of, if you'd have had them checked maybe around 8 a.m.
Mm.
So 309 is not bad. 309 is decent. Optimal range for free testosterone is probably in the 5 to 700 mark. Some people get 725. I mean, I checked someone the other day, they actually did have something like 730, and I was like, whoa, okay.
Crazy.
That's a bit unusual. I mean, usually I'm seeing people, so many men, they've got like 100, 150, like 200 maybe. Like they're so low. This testosterone level is so low. What's kind of actively reducing this is the sex hormone binding globulin here. And what SHBG does is it does what it says on the tin. It's a binding hormone it's a binding globulin for sex hormones. So it's effectively reducing your free testosterone level. And we have this in the body as like a check, because uncontrolled rampant hormones, can cause issues. We see this with people, juicing and, stuff like that that can cause problems. So we have this almost as like a check in the system, but sometimes it can be a little bit elevated, which will then reduce the free testosterone just a little bit too much. As that total testosterone goes up, sex hormone binding globulin will also go up, generally speaking, to compensate, to keep it in check. Your SHBG is not bad by any means, 32. It's pretty reasonable. Things that can increase the total testosterone. So having it checked at the right time is important. So we'll bear that one in mind, but I've labored that point, I think, now. Zinc level. So I like to pair this myself with a zinc, because then almost always I'm seeing low testosterone. So I might as well just check a zinc anyway, because you can't add it on with the labs. You have to get another blood draw. So I just get it all done at the same time. Zinc will increase testosterone. So I'm sure we've all probably heard that seafood, like oysters, they're an aphrodisiac.
Oh, I haven't heard that actually.
You've not? Okay.
I've heard that excessive, you know what I'm talking about. Like if you play with yourself too much, then you release zinc.
Yeah. So yeah, basically, I mean, people say oysters are an aphrodisiac. I'm not entirely certain on that one, because eating something like particularly slimy and messy, I'm not sure is going to make me super horny, but people say it does. But that's because it's really high in zinc, and zinc boosts your testosterone, and for male and women, and it will also boost estrogen as well. So the sex hormone, of course. So zinc will generally increase testosterone levels. Optimum zinc range here in Australia is probably 15 to 25. Most people I'm seeing like 10, 11, 12. So a lot of people are low in zinc as well. So it's always a good chance you're low in zinc. Seafood is a good source of zinc. I do myself personally like smoked oysters. I just buy them from a can. I'm not super posh eating oysters in restaurants or anything. Interestingly, carbohydrates can lower SHBG. And this is a point that Paul Saladino makes, and I saw this as well. The moment I input carbs back in my diet, my SHBG went down quite significantly, and my my free testosterone went up quite a lot. What the mechanism is there, I don't know. But if you're already eating a very high carbohydrate diet, that's not going to improve SHBG. But if you're eating an ultra low carbohydrate diet like carnivore, for example, longer term, I have seen this issue with people with the SHBG starting to rise, which is then reducing their free testosterone. When they introduce carbohydrates, their SHBG just goes right down again, and their free testosterone just jumps up. But not all carbs are created equal. And if you look at the research, grains, so cereals, grains, oats, things like that, some vegetables and insoluble fiber tends to increase SHBG, which is generally not really what you want to do, because you want generally more free active hormones, because they're the active part. If you want to lose weight, get healthy, build muscle, etc., you want those to be free and active and helping you. You don't really want to bind all those up. And then if you look at soluble fiber, which tends to be more the fruit, although there's a mix, fruit and then things like honey, dairy, they tend to reduce sex hormone binding globulin, which generally is the better way, which is very interesting. And I mean, this brings us to things like Mr. Kellogg and the Kellogg's cornflakes and the story of him with the sanitarium. And do you know this story with No? Okay, so I think it's is it J. Harvey Kellogg or Harvey J. I can never remember. I think it's J. Harvey Kellogg. Anyway, one of the Kellogg's brothers. This is in his diary. So it's pretty much fact. Even though, again, I mean, Saladino, I've listened to his podcast. He mentioned he did an Instagram reel on this, and basically it got taken down, but he fact checked and it got taken down, even though it's basically in his diary and it's like basically fact. He was in charge of this sanitarium, this mental hospital, And he basically wanted to stop the inmates, as they were called at the time, from masturbating,
Yeah.
trying to escape, and basically wanted them to just become docile and take their medications and stop fighting the guards and all the rest of it. And he basically found that feeding them Kellogg's cornflakes had this effect, that it reduced their libido. They stopped masturbating.
Yeah.
They became docile and placid, and they just basically took their meds and stopped trying to escape. And they just kind of just let them do what they kind of wanted to the inmates, which is crazy. And we're sold this as like, oh, it's a great way to start your breakfast, to start your day. Just tank your testosterone. Like, why not? So yeah, grains can lower this free testosterone. You're right. Also, I mean, sexual activity. So, I mean, I'm not going to, delve into that too much today, but when you get it checked again, just get it checked on a day where you haven't had, a vigorous amount, a small bit of sex. a light session. My shows are marked explicit. A light sexual session wouldn't really reduce your testosterone very much. But a vigorous session can. And yeah, I wouldn't typically be recommending someone masturbates before they go and get the blood test. If you really just wait until afterwards.
For the record, I didn't,
because that could also theoretically reduce the testosterone. 309 is a decent level. I mean, you're not looking at TRT or anything for this level. And bearing in mind, again, it was taken outside the optimum time frame. It may well be more like 4 to 450, which is perfectly fine. I'd be very happy with a 450 free testosterone here in Australia. Optimum's probably 500 to 700, but very few people really get that. And it's really only through dumb luck almost that these people get it. That guy I was mentioning earlier, he actually came in wanting TRT because he thought his testosterone was low. It's actually really high.
You mentioned zinc before, like with oysters. I always found that oysters tended to inflame me. Are there any other sources of zinc?
Seafood generally is going to be good for zinc. So, prawns,
fish,
any small fish like sardines, things like that. Fish in general is reasonable for zinc. Anything that's kind of protein rich. So theoretically, meat should be really good in zinc as well. And oysters are not like crazy higher than meat. They're a bit higher, but they're not like it's only oysters and nothing else. One of the key things with zinc that I've certainly heard, I think it's Judy Cho from Nutrition with Judy. I heard this on her show and I tried it and it did actually make a difference for me, was the timing of drinks around meals. And if you drink with meals, then it can dilute your stomach acid, which can actually interfere with the zinc being essentially unlocked, quote unquote, from the food. So usually when I'm seeing a low zinc, I talk to people about seafood and maybe medications and whatever to bring it back up if they really want to, and then meat and so on. But I also talk to them about maybe spacing out drinks from meal times as well, about half an hour. Your average stomach acid is around about 20 to 100 mils. So if you drink, let's say, a liter of water with a meal, which some people will do, maybe half a liter, let's say, and you've got 20 mils of stomach acid, you're potentially diluting that down to, a liter would be 50 times dilution for 20 mils. If you've got 100 mils of stomach acid and you're drinking 500 mils of water, then your fluid, then it's 5 times dilution. That's a pretty significant dilution. I mean, up to 50 times dilution. That's a pretty significant dilution effect that may interfere with things like zinc and perhaps other minerals as well that need this stomach acid to actually unlock the zinc. And so you can then actually make it available to your body to actually absorb it. So that's something else that can work. And when I did that, my zinc went up by about 50% when I actually spaced out fluids from meal times.
Yeah.
It's hard because we're kind of conditioned to drink with meals.
Yeah. So I actually don't drink with meals as much. Like when I finish my meal, I actually tended to have hot water because I don't know how true it is, but I know that there's Japanese stories of drinking hot water after meals in order to allow the food to sit in your stomach or remove all of those toxins. I don't know. The fats.
There's a lot of stuff that's handed down through history that Western medicine just poo-poos and says it's just stupid nonsense, whatever. But I mean, we know better than that, you know. There's a lot of stuff that's genuine, that's true. Yeah, we might not be able to prove it or really study it, but we know that there's a lot of things that do work. So
Yeah.
you know, there may well be truth in that. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, other carnivores talk about how don't drink as much water. Like there's this drink 8 glasses a day, but I know there's stories from other carnivores saying, you know, if you drink too much water, then you know there's problems, there's issues with having too much water, and you actually don't need that as much. And I
There
don't
can
know,
be.
I haven't
Yeah.
done enough research on this, but
Yeah, I mean, there can
yeah,
be issues with too much water, but I mean, most people are never going to really drink enough water to really cause themselves a problem.
mm,
Outside of things like, I think is it ecstasy, you know, drugs, which I don't condone. YouTube, don't ban me. Can stimulate people to just drink loads, just excessive drinking, to do with their ADH hormone, and they basically just end up just drowning themselves in water. They can do, very rare, but it can happen.
wow,
But I mean, lots of water. You'll be weeing loads. You'll just kind of pee out all your electrolytes. Carnivores have issues with this anyway, because mostly things like potassium, because carbs can stimulate aldosterone
mm,
production, which stimulates the kidneys to hold on to potassium. But there may be other issues, things like magnesium and so on as well. Um, let's move on because I'm conscious of time because
yeah,
we're going through slowly.
yeah,
TSH, so your thyroid function test. Ideally, I'd like to see a T3 and T4 as well with this, which is really like the kind of active thyroid hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone very quickly is produced by the pituitary gland, which then kind of feeds to the thyroid and tells the thyroid to produce thyroid hormones. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid then produces T4, which is then kind of converted into T3 and reverse T3. So you see some people talking about reverse T3. I very rarely check reverse T3. I've checked it, I think, maybe 2 or 3 times. Mostly, it's not been very useful for people. It costs about $50 here in Australia. Medicare doesn't cover it. Um, and a full T3, T4 also costs about $50 on top as well here in Australia, because Medicare don't do that unless you've got a problem with the thyroid. Unless your TSH is out, then they'll check it. TSH of 1.9 is pretty much in the optimal range. So we generally see people doing the best. Again, the reference range 0.5 to 4 here, micro IUs per liter. We generally see people just feeling the best and doing the best in terms of T3 and T4 around maybe 1.5 to perhaps 2, maybe 2.5, maybe. Probably 1.5 to 2 is typically where I would be trying to get people if I'm really chasing the 1%, you know, and the thyroid and so on. So 1.9 is pretty much perfect. I'd be very happy with this. I probably wouldn't bother doing the T3, T4, to be honest.
mm,
If you're keen to spend money, yeah, you could get it checked, but I'd be very happy with this TSH of 1.9. I don't think there's anything to really talk about here, particularly other than, again, I mean, carbohydrates. TSH is something that I have seen issues with some carnivores with. And it's going down. And I know people again like Saladino. I mention him a lot because he's a carb advocate, of course, and he's the animal-based diet, which is what you're doing.
yeah,
Do say that carbs are needed to support the thyroid. I'm not sure that's entirely true. And I was having a conversation with a patient about this very thing the other day. And, you know, I kind of said that maybe it's more that for optimal thyroid function, maybe carbs are beneficial. I think as far as absolute thyroid function, no, carbs are not essential, because otherwise we would see things like congenital hypothyroidism in the Inuit population. I know Chafee talks about that. And we don't see that because that's congenital hypothyroidism. Then you basically, your offspring has cretinism, which is a medical term. Cretin is cretin is a slang term, slur term, basically for people who are mentally kind of retarded and so on. But
mm,
cretinism is a genuine medical term, and you're infertile. You can't have kids.
wow,
So basically, your species dies out. If you
mm,
have congenital hypothyroidism, you kind of can't. You can only reproduce once, and then that's it. And so your entire bloodline basically dies out. Now, someone like the Inuits, which never have access to carbohydrates historically, I mean, they'd all be dead.
yeah,
There would be no Inuits because they wouldn't be able to survive. So we can't say that carbohydrates are essential for thyroid function, but perhaps for optimal thyroid function? Maybe there's an argument to be made there, because we do see it dropping down on this kind of very, very ultra low carbohydrate diet on carnivore. Again, I've rarely seen it on keto, and it bounces back up again when people eat carbs. Devil's advocate, people in the carnivore community would say, well, carbs push up the thyroid. And so what you're seeing there is not an optimal thyroid, it's a suboptimal, because carbs are pushing it up, and the thyroid has to go up to compensate, to burn off the carbs and so on. I'm not sure who's right. We don't know. We don't know. But TSH of 1.9, I'd be happy with this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Moving on, your fasting glucose is 4.6, which is excellent. It's very good.
Great.
Very
So,
good. So
you said before that 2 to 3 is excellent. So 4.6 is above that. It's okay.
that was fasting insulin.
So sorry.
Fasting, yeah. The glucose of 2 to 3 would probably be a bit low. Glucose of 2, I'd be quite concerned. But yeah, fasting insulin. So this is fasting glucose. So your fasting glucose is 4.6. Again, we use different ranges to America. I can't off the top of my head remember what it would be for them. This is millimoles per liter, so Americans can go and work it out if they want to. So fasting glucose of 4.6, reference range being 4 to 6 from this lab. A fasting glucose of above 7 is typically we're looking then at type 2 diabetes. A random glucose of above 11.1 is also indicative of type 2 diabetes. So this is a fasting glucose of 4.6, which is very, very good. What we're not seeing here is an elevated glucose. So all that fruit is not elevating your blood glucose level.
Woohoo!
which is very, very good. And I mean, swiftly moving on, let's go down to the HbA1c, which I think is right at the bottom here somewhere. HbA1c is 4.3, which is absolutely perfect.
Wow, there you go.
Absolutely perfect. Now we don't have a baseline for you. So
there you go.
don't know if it's getting better or worse, but it's absolutely perfect.
So I remember you saying in the other podcast we did how HbA1c has been alleged to rise if you're increasing carbohydrates. Yes. And this is exactly what you said, that Sean Baker, his HbA1c was like 6%.
On his previous ones, I think like 5 years ago. Yeah, I don't know if he's done it since. I haven't seen. I know he's done some bloods, but I don't know if he's done HbA1c. Dr. Berry's, I think, was 5.5.
Which you were saying was almost pre-diabetic.
Well, I mean, America uses 5.7 for pre-diabetes. So in that sense, yes, it's almost pre-diabetic. Australia, we use 6% as a pre-diabetic. I would personally say 5.5 actually is probably more the cutoff, because above that, people just tend to go up. But yours is 4.3, which is amazing. And again, I mean, Paul Saladino's, I think, is very similar, maybe slightly higher than yours. But yeah, 4.3 is amazing, which basically means your red blood cells are not overly getting glycated.
Yeah.
The caveat to this, and I know that people are going to bring this up, so I'm preempting this, is fructose. Fructose glycation is not adequately detected by HbA1c. That's the caveat. Now, the likelihood is that this is not a problem. And this brings us to this idea of this picture that I was talking about. So the picture here is one of very low insulin resistance, very low levels of glycation, because your fasting glucose is excellent, your HbA1c is excellent, and your fasting insulin is excellent. So we've got multiple factors showing us that you're metabolically healthy.
Okay.
But yes, an HbA1c technically won't really very well represent fructose glycation. And I know this is a criticism. You mentioned Bart K earlier. He's criticized Paul Saladino and his ability to read studies, because I know Paul Saladino showed a study that he said showed that fructose is represented in HbA1c, and actually he was kind of wrong with that. Bart K was right. It actually wasn't a good study to reference, because it didn't actually show what Saladino said. So that's the caveat. Unfortunately, there isn't really any test that does show fructose glycation.
Okay.
So there's really no way of actually checking that outside of research stuff. And even fructosamine, which we do sometimes check for very short-term diabetic monitoring, like if we really want to see rapid changes and so on, we don't want to wait for HbA1c to change. Even fructosamine doesn't measure fructose glycation.
Mm.
You'd think it would, but it doesn't. So that's the caveat. But the likelihood is that this is not a concern because how much fructose are you eating? I mean, fruit is about 5% ish fructose,
Yeah, I
about
eat
5
quite a lot of
ish,
fruit.
but
I
it's
don't
about
know exactly
5%
the amount.
glucose, about
Mm.
5% fructose. So the likelihood is that if you were having significant fructose glycation, your fasting glucose would probably be higher, your fasting insulin would probably be a lot higher, and your HbA1c would also probably be higher because of the corresponding increase in glucose as well. Does that make sense?
Mm. Yeah.
So the fructose wouldn't affect the HbA1c, but the glucose you're getting with the fructose would also probably be raising it. So
Mm.
the picture is that this is fine. This is perfect.
So it wouldn't raise HbA1c, but you're saying would it rise the fasting insulin and glucose?
Yeah, basically they would rise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're getting insulin resistant in essence, then not specifically glycation, no, but in essence, yeah, they would rise because there's going to be a secondary effect on those systems, and you're going to get that feedback. Glucose is going to start to go up, insulin's going to start to go up, and so on. That's just what happens. So the HbA1c again is just a single figure, but the picture here is very, very not insulin resistant.
Okay. So that's the fasting glucose. Is there one for fasting insulin too, or?
Correct, there is. Let me go down a little bit. So your fasting insulin was 3,
Oh, great.
which is excellent. So again, I don't like to look at a single item to just say, I mentioned the fasting insulin. Yours is 3, absolutely perfect. I mean, again,
So
in the context of a low HbA1c, a low fasting glucose, this fasting insulin is amazing. You are likely to be incredibly insulin sensitive,
okay,
which is
so
good.
that's optimal. Like you want it lower.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. For the most part, yes. Again, the picture. We want a fasting insulin to be low with a low fasting glucose and a low
Mm.
fasting HbA and a low HbA1c. We don't want a low insulin and then like a high fasting glucose. I mentioned my diabetic patient, the fasting insulin of 3, fasting glucose of like 25. So,
Mm.
yeah, there's a problem there. But
Mm.
the picture is excellent.
That's
Absolutely.
fascinating because I was concerned in the sense that people like I'm eating carnivore, and before I was eating carnivore with only a small amount of fruit. But now I'm eating carnivore with a lot of fruit.
Yeah.
So I remember doing research on Dr. Paul Mason, and he was saying how, you know, LDL is not the bad guy. It's only the bad guy, in his words, when it hangs out with the delinquent sugar. And so it glycates the LDL. And so it did cross my mind that by eating a lot of sugar or fructose from fruit, I may be glycating this LDL. But from the research I've done, it seems to be that if fruit is wrapped up in fiber, it takes longer for the fructose or the glucose to be released, and so
It
the
does.
insulin spikes is less.
It does. The insulin spike is less. Insulin, and this is a bit off topic here, but because everyone's looking at CGMs and continuous glucose monitors now, and everyone's getting obsessed, especially in the carnivore community. They're getting obsessed about this minor spike in glucose. But what they really need to look at is actually the area under the curve, the area under the line. Because if you
Mm.
go straight up and straight down, that's a normal response. That's fine. That's perfectly fine.
Mm.
If you go to fasting glucose of like 30 when you eat an apple, like that's a concern. But if
Mm.
you just spike up to say like 10 and then back down again, like that's a relatively normal response for
What
someone.
about Professor Bart Kay when he says you're cooking your body, in his words,
Yeah,
every
not a
time
lot of
these spikes
evidence.
happen?
Not a lot of evidence to support that. I've heard people saying this kind of thing, and it's all to do with things like advanced glycation end products, and there's not a lot of evidence to really support that because if your fasting glucose goes straight up and then straight down again, like that's fine. Your glucose is basically gone from your bloodstream. You're not really glycating anything. Your body's dealt with it. It's fine. It's
Mm.
gone. It's basically been transformed into something else. It's not really glycating anything. If it goes up and stays up, that's a big problem. Yeah.
Mm.
But the other problem that we do sometimes see is when people have this kind of slow rise and then very, very, very slow fall again. And the area under that curve is actually quite high.
Yeah.
even though they didn't actually go that much higher. And people like, I think it's Marty Kendall, who I've interviewed on the show. He's an excellent source of information. I think he spoke a little bit about this as well, about CGMs and people being obsessed about this spike of glucose when it's actually completely normal,
Mm.
but actually missing the point where if you actually have a lower, a slower, but ultimately more sustained rise in glucose, that's actually a concern.
Mm.
That's more of a concern. And again, this is what I've seen on people with carnivores. The fasting glucose has started to go up. And people
Yeah.
like Sean Baker, his fasting glucose was actually pretty high. Again, 5 years ago, I'm not sure what it is lately. Ken Berry's was a little bit on the borderline, slightly high as well. Judy Cho, hers, when I saw her last blood test, they were slightly elevated, not like diabetic elevated, but slightly elevated. And actually, that's going to lead to more glycation when you've got a high fasting glucose. That's going to lead to more glycation, not a big spike and straight down again.
Yeah. So I've seen videos from Dr. Anthony Shafee where he talks about we have 5 grams of 5 grams of sugar in our blood. And so anything more than that teaspoon is toxic. So why is Dr. Anthony Shafee and Professor Bart Kay so adamant that adding fruit into a carnivore diet is so toxic for you and it's dangerous? Like, is there any evidence to prove this at all?
You'd kind of have to ask them that. I know Bart Kay eats blueberries, so I'm not sure why he's kind of so against. I'm pretty sure he does anyway, blueberries. I'm not sure why he's so against sugar. Dr. Anthony Chafee, I mean, he can talk for himself, obviously, but we have to remember sometimes, with these people, they've got a brand to protect, as well. And if you build your brand on zero sugar, and then you start to say that sugar's fine, that's a bit of an issue.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Saladino did it, and people criticize him all the time, saying, "Oh, he went back on himself." And
exactly. I mean, I've introduced some vegetables and stuff in my diet, and people are calling me vegan now, and it's like, I eat like 95% meat. How am I vegan?
Well, yeah,
people just go crazy. So look, I don't know. I mean, there are some issues with sugar in excess in some people, yes, but then you see things like Walter Kempner and the rice diet, which 1939, I think it was. Now, the science is fascinating. The ethics were disgusting and terrible. And this guy was like force feeding people in like prison camps and whipping them. And like, it was terrible. But he basically just fed people like just basically almost pure carbohydrate diet, white rice, white sugar. And they transformed their health. They lost tons of weight. They cured things like diabetes, insulin resistance just disappeared, and they kept all the weight off. They kept metabolically healthy, which is just absolutely fascinating and completely flies in the face of this whole sugar's going to kill you and cause diabetes and everything. Again, the science was fascinating. The study was terrible, ethically, of course. But I think there's a lot of nuance to it. And I think when you live in these extremes, you miss the nuance. And it's the right diet for the right person at the right time in their life. Because, like a Olympic athlete, they can probably eat a ton of sugar. They're training 24 hours a day. They can just burn through glucose like crazy. It's not going to cause them any problems, really. But, someone like me who basically sits on my butt all day, consulting patients, and I do like 20 minutes of exercise a day at most, because that's barely any time that I have. I can't just sit there eating glucose all day. I've got to keep my glucose quite low on the whole, because I'm very carb sensitive and I will struggle with that. And this is a criticism people have of Paul Saladino, saying, well, he's surfing 2-3 hours a day and he's active and he's doing stuff and whatever. And yeah, that may be true. He also may be less sensitive to those carbs, maybe more accommodating his body, his metabolism and so on. But he's got quite a bit of muscle. He's got very low body fat percentage. And he's going to be just burning that glucose when it comes in. He's going to be burning it. Most people are metabolically unhealthy. We know this. About 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. We know this from latest studies. And so that's the target population. It's not necessarily people like you. It's not people like Paul Saladino. It's not people like Anthony Chafee, Paul Mason, Baker, Berry, whatever. All these people. Average Joe is metabolically unhealthy with probably sarcopenia, very little muscle mass. So they can't actually deal with these glucose, spikes.
Mhm.
And what's his name? Is it Brian Sanders? Is it from Food Lies? I think it is. Um, I think he put a tweet saying, something along the lines, slightly paraphrase, rather than obsessing about, the 1% sugar and small spikes in glucose from sugar,
Mm.
focus on building a body and building muscle that can deal with the spike.
Mm.
And I thought that
It's
was
a good
actually a
point.
really interesting point, actually, and very, very well, very good point to make. People are
Mm.
obsessing about this spike of sugar and going to, people are arguing about which brand of cream to use in their coffee. Like 1 teaspoon of cream that's got 0.1 milligrams of sugar difference per 100 mils. And they're arguing about which one's got lower sugar.
Yeah.
And it's like, hang on, you've got a 20th of 100 mil, like a
Yeah.
teaspoon is 5 mils, and it's 0.1 grams per 100 mils, like difference. Like,
Yeah.
who the hell cares? Like, why
Yeah.
are you obsessing about this tiny, minuscule drop in sugar rather than just like, doing a bicep curl? Like, come on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, people also obsess about when to eat fruit. They say, you can't eat fruit and meat at the same time because then it will blockade in the Randall cycle. But even Professor Bart Kay was saying it doesn't matter if you eat fruit half an hour before, 2 hours after, because it's happening
Exactly.
at a cellular level. And so it will mix even if unless you've had fruit 3 days after, it will mix at a
Yeah.
cellular level.
Basically, yeah. Unless you just don't eat like 3-4 days in between, it really makes no difference unless you're just eating it 24/7. But again, it's
Mm.
what's happening at the mitochondrial level, and that's not what's going in your mouth. That's what's happening with your blood glucose and your blood, free fatty acids and so on, which we don't really measure free fatty acids, but yeah, blood glucose. So again, if you've got a pretty low fasting glucose, you're insulin sensitive, those spikes in blood sugar just generally don't really matter that much. To be
Mm.
perfectly honest. So again, coming back to your bloods, the picture is excellent. Moving on, because we haven't got much left to cover. I'm conscious of time. We've been talking for
Yeah.
a while. You're being very patient here. Your total cholesterol is, let's talk about cholesterol. Okay, so we mentioned it earlier. Cholesterol is very poorly associated with heart disease, but there is an association. So I don't think we should be blasé about it. I don't think we should ignore it completely. Things like triglycerides, HDL, and so on. And you did mention off air. Let's bring up your previous ones. I don't know if it is on here. Your triglycerides were lower previously.
That's
And I
right.
think you
So
said your HDL was a little bit better. I don't know if I have it on here. There we go.
so
Yeah.
I remember my previous one, my triglyceride to HDL level was just around 0.3. So, but
Yeah.
now my triglyceride to HDL level is around 0.8. So it has increased.
Is that a problem though? That's the question.
Well, Dr. Paul Mason says it should be below 0.8. So mine was like 0.84. So I wasn't sure.
It's an interesting question, and I'm not necessarily expecting you to know the answer. I don't necessarily know the answer. What's very interesting is, again, and I'll reference my carnivore patients because generally their triglycerides are very low and their HDL goes up pretty high.
Mm.
But I've seen, even despite that improvement in that ratio, so it's actually gone down, their LDL subfraction, so their small dense LDL, has actually got slightly worse. So this idea that the triglyceride to HDL ratio is this really good marker of small dense LDL, oxidized LDL, and so on, it's not actually. On the whole, it works pretty well. But again, there's maybe nuance that we just don't quite understand. Generally speaking, I think if your ratio is less than 1, you're going to be absolutely fine for the most part.
Okay.
So I'm not sure I'd
What,
overly worry about this.
why do you think it's gone up?
The triglycerides can go up for all sorts of reasons. People talk about excessive carbohydrates raising triglycerides, and yes, that can happen. For the most part, again, if you go through the Randall cycle and so on, this is where triglycerides kind of come out of this and so on. Basically, I think, and again, Marty Kendall spoke about this in my interview with him, it's more of an excess energy than an excess carbohydrate, so to speak. And he talks about this concept of energy toxicity rather than glucose toxicity or fat toxicity, whatever. He talks about energy toxicity, which I think is an interesting take on it. And I think he's probably onto something there.
What does that mean? Like too much food or not enough exercise?
Basically a bit of both. So it's anything in excess, essentially. So excess fat, excess carbohydrates, whatever it is, your body basically just has more energy than it can utilize. And then it's going to be put into then storage and start to cause problems if it's not being utilized. The most obvious one is glucose, because that is the most damaging. And that's why we have so many systems to lower that blood glucose, like insulin and so on. It's very tightly regulated, whereas fat is a lot less of an issue. But anything in excess can cause problems. We mentioned in my podcast with you, excessive free fatty acids can cause issues with, again, the Randall cycle, and maybe partly why some of these carnivores are seeing this increase in insulin resistance. So a triglyceride, ideally I'd like less than 1, but 1.1 is perfectly fine. Again, we're splitting hairs. There's some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think before it was a lot lower.
It was before, let's have a look, 0.6.
0.6.
This can change on day to day. So I wouldn't overly stress about this.
What about the
change
HDL? Does the HDL
takes quite a long time to change. So yours was 1.8 previously. It's actually gone down to 1.3. That's kind of gone in the wrong direction. But
yeah, because Dr. Paul Mason said it should be above 2.
I'm not sure I'd necessarily agree with that. Look, Dr. Paul Mason's a very intelligent man, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with him on a lot of stuff he says, but there is evidence that HDL above 2, I have to double check the data, maybe above 2.5 perhaps, can actually start to be potentially harmful. It's associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, again, which is very interesting because it's just the good HDL, the HDL is good, the more the better, but actually that may not be the case. Whether there's some genetic thing, people just have familial hypercholesterolemia, familial cholesterol problems, we don't know, have a high HDL, there could be some issues there. But yes, the HDL has dropped. I mean, typically things that increase HDL, saturated fat will increase HDL typically. Monounsaturated fat will increase HDL. Carbohydrates generally won't do that much to HDL either way, particularly, other than if you're replacing
that's the thing.
Carbohydrates, which may be what you've done.
I used to eat 8 steaks a day, and now I'm only eating like 3 to 4, if max. A lot of money too.
I imagine it probably is. I can't afford that. But that's probably why your HDL's dropped, because you've replaced saturated fat. Monounsaturated
with carbohydrates,
fat typically increase HDL as well. Exercise will increase HDL, particularly resistance training can increase HDL. So again, 1.3 is okay. I would probably be aiming 1.5 plus.
Yeah, because again, Dr. Paul Mason said the HDL should be triglyceride should be below 0.5, but above 2 is the HDL.
Yeah, I mean, triglycerides below 0.5, I mean, as a ratio, yes. As an absolute, that's pretty low. I mean, perfect. Yeah, if they're below 0.5, but anything below 1 is very, very good. I mean, again, we're splitting hairs really when you get to down to that level.
Okay.
But an HDL of 1.3 is reasonable, but I'd like to see it a little bit higher, ideally. We mentioned, of course, LDL. Your LDL is 3.5. Now, these are outside of the high risk ranges. And if you look down here, it's got talking about, some of the reference ranges, primary prevention, secondary prevention, and so on. Primary prevention is you've never had a heart attack. We're trying to prevent that. Secondary is you've already had a heart attack. We want to stop you getting another one. So these are the reference ranges for basically high risk individuals. So they're saying that your triglyceride should be below 2, your LDL should be below 2. HDL should be below 1. I mean, HDL should be above 1, really. 1.5 really for high risk individuals, and triglycerides should be below 1 for high risk individuals. These reference ranges are kind of rubbish. But LDL below 2, I mean, what's very interesting, even if you look at things like the ARIC study, the optimum range for LDL cholesterol is probably somewhere in the maybe even 2.5 to 4 range for LDL cholesterol, which you're pretty much smack bang in the middle of, 3.5. And there's other studies, and again, Paul Mason has done work on this with people like Ben Bickman and so on, saying that actually optimal LDL probably is actually higher. And this is actually well referenced. There's a lot of information out there in certain age groups, 65 plus, for example, showing high LDL is actually protective, for things like pneumonia, for example, may lower the risk of dementia. actually conversely can lower the risk of cardiovascular disease for some people.
Yeah. Dr. Anthony Shavy talks about that.
Yeah, and people like with familial hypercholesterolemia, lowering the cholesterol doesn't actually necessarily make a lot of difference to their cardiovascular disease again. So LDL cholesterol, and we mentioned this with Baker earlier, Sean Baker doing his test as well with the exercise, using it as a single marker is not that useful. I did reference remnant cholesterol earlier. So I've worked out your remnant cholesterol, and this is very well correlated with cardiovascular disease. The lower, the better. Your remnant cholesterol, which is total cholesterol minus LDL minus HDL, is 0.5. And this is essentially a pseudo marker or an easy way, a poor man's calculator of working out what's all your bad stuff, basically. And yours is 0.5, which is excellent. It's very low.
Okay.
It's very
That's
low.
good.
And above about 2, the risks start to go up quite a lot, off the top of my head. 0.5 is excellent. So again, I really wouldn't worry about this this cholesterol. And you certainly wouldn't benefit from a statin or anything at this age.
Can I question? So at this age, was the question I was going to ask. Like, I'm 27 now. What about if I'm 47 in 20 years' time? Will this diet still last me?
I don't see why not. At 47, I mentioned at this age, what I kind of meant by that was not that, well, suddenly you're 47, you're 50, whatever, and now you need a statin. No, but you tend to get other issues, when we get older, and risks can go up for other reasons. If I see a 47-year-old with no other real risk factors with these results, I'm happy. I'm very happy, in fact. And we go through the calculators and we talk about the pros and cons and whatever, of course. But yeah, basically, I'm very happy if I see someone with a cholesterol of this level. I'm happy. Yeah.
Great.
Basically, that's the long and I'm happy.
Yeah.
And they're happy because I'm not putting them on a statin.
Yeah.
Most people on statins don't really benefit from them. That's the thing. That's the sad thing. And very few people get a proper conversation. When you actually give them the side effects, like, it can increase your risk of diabetes, it can increase your risk potentially of some cancers, and potentially increase the risk of dementia and so on. They're like, why would I want that?
Yeah.
I don't want that.
Yeah, even Dr. Anthony Shavy says that 50% of heart attack cases have high LDL, low LDL. So it really, how can you actually determine whether the heart attacks correlate to LDL?
It's about, I think about 45%, roughly about half. Yeah, just less than half, I think. But there is a caveat to that. And that is that most people who have I'd have to double check the data on this, but a lot of people who have heart attacks are secondary prevention, subsequent heart attacks, in which case they're already at very high risk.
Okay.
And lowering that cholesterol doesn't actually necessarily make a lot of difference, which again is an argument not for statins, but against statins. But there's a bit of nuance to that, saying just, well, people have a low cholesterol, have a heart attack, so it doesn't really matter. There's a nuance to that conversation. But that's, if anything, it's an argument against statins rather than for it. Yeah. I know people like Dr. Aseem Malhotra, a cardiologist in the UK, very outspoken cardiologist, very well known on his views on COVID injections and so on, which we won't discuss too much today.
We don't want to get you cancelled.
We don't want to get you banned. He says very similar things, that most people who are on statins, but he is outspoken on that because he is a very big advocate for deprescribing, not against the pharmaceutical industry. He wants medications to be useful for people, but he's a big advocate for, stripping back medications, not starting medications. Over prescribing to people is a real problem in the UK, as it is everywhere. And he's really campaigning for people to just wake up and say, you don't need all these medications. And so I know he is generally against statins for most people that I've seen of his work anyway. But I also know that he does prescribe them at the same time for some patients, for those very high risk patients. And that, I think, is again a nuance to the conversation around statins that's missing in some communities, in some circles, that for the very high risk people, yeah, they probably do benefit from a statin. Overall, it's just that pool of people who benefit is probably very low compared to the people who get them, which is huge.
Mm.
So again, statins is another conversation which we probably haven't got time
Yeah.
for today.
It'll be interesting to ask the question. You said secondary heart attacks compromise the majority of heart attack cases in that statistic.
I'd have to double check that. I may be wrong on that, but
But what
a
about
large
for
proportion, yeah, would be anyway.
but what about for like primary heart attack cases? I wonder what ratio of high LDL is correlated to that.
That I don't know, but it's not very well correlated. It's really not.
Mm.
And I did a thing, an episode not long ago now, looking at this paper from the UK Biobank, which basically showed that LDL cholesterol was a really low risk factor on the
Heart
risk
attacks.
of heart attacks, basically all cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and so on. It's very poorly correlated. But then things like remnant cholesterol, small dense LDL, LP little a, these are much, much, much better correlated.
Mm.
And things like CRP, moving on with the podcast,
Mm.
your CRP, let's go down to that. Your CRP was less than 1, which is excellent, which is very good. CRP, C-reactive protein, this is an inflammatory marker. And if you recall, I mentioned a little while ago, about probably an hour ago now, with your ferritin, was maybe it's slightly above where I'd like to see it, and it's an inflammatory marker. But
Mm.
your CRP is less than 1, so your inflammation is basically pretty much 0, and this correlates very well with a very low risk of heart disease as well. So less than
Right.
1 is where we're aiming. That's absolutely perfect. The lab's just gone down to less than 1, so we don't know exactly how low it is, but yeah, basically lower the better. Your liver function and your kidney function. So your liver function has improved quite a lot. If we go back to your previous, where was it? There we go. Your liver function's improved quite a lot, actually. So previously your ALT was 72, AST was 36, and your gamma GT was 16. Now your gamma GT is 18, which is a marginal change and nothing to be worried about. If it's less than 25, we're happy. AST's gone down. I think, what is it, 32 before, 36. It's now 27, which has gone
And
down.
it's not in bold anymore. So
No, and it's not in red. Less than 25 would be ideal, but
yeah.
less than 30 is fine, and less than in the reference range. And your ALT is 45, which is still a little bit elevated, but it's
Yeah.
down from that 72.
It was always around 72 high, and it was always bold, and the doctors always picked up on it.
And it may be the G6PD that's certainly having an issue there. The ALT is still a little bit elevated for my liking. And I actually, in kind of the notes that I was going to send to you after this,
Mm.
I did mention things like fatty liver, because if ALT is above 25, there's a reasonable chance you could be getting some fatty liver. An ALT of 45 isolated by itself is usually a marker of fatty liver. But given that yours is improved and you've got the G6PD, that may not necessarily be the case.
It could. I'd actually talked to Dr. Kiltz about this when I did an interview with him, and he said it could be the fact that you've eaten a lot of toxic foods across your life, and you've been on all of these medicines, and you're, given the condition you were in with eczema, it's going to take time for your liver to recover from that.
It does take time. And ALT going up says that your liver's kind of working a little bit harder. But your gamma GT being 18 shows me that your liver's not particularly stressed. So there's no real stress on your liver, particularly.
But my ALT went up from before. Is that true?
No, your ALT's gone down. So
Yeah,
it was
that's what I assumed.
72, and now it's 45. So
Yeah.
it's above where I'd like to see it, but that may
Yeah.
be the G6PD. So you could get an ultrasound of your liver if you haven't had one already, just to double check. Because again, there's people out there that would say that fructose causes fatty liver, and and so on. And again, the studies looking at this, they really don't use fructose. They use high fructose corn syrup, or they use cornstarch. They use really
right.
overly sugary drinks and fruit juices. They're not really using whole foods for these studies.
Yeah, refined fructose.
Exactly. So,
And for context as well, like that ALT was always high. Like when I was on a standard diet, even before a carnivore diet, it was always high.
So it's better than it was. So again, are you causing yourself harm with this diet? Unlikely, because it's better than it was. Your kidney function is generally okay. Your electrolytes and so on, they're generally okay. The GFR, the EGFR down here, estimated glomerular filtration rate, 76 is a touch on the low side, but you're not going to be getting kidney failure or anything at this age, of course, with this diet. It's probably you just didn't have much fluids, especially if it was around 10:45 a.m. So maybe next time you go for a test, just drink a decent glass of water beforehand.
Is that improved? I mean, is it from before? Is it
It's gone
lower
down
or higher?
slightly, actually. It's gone down slightly, but this will vary day to day. If you had a decent glass of water, it'd probably come back up to like 90 or something anyway. So
Okay.
your electrolytes, a lot of people come to me, they want electrolytes checked. What they don't realize is that this is in the blood. With things like cramps, it's kind of more what's happening at the cellular level,
Mm.
not at like the neuromuscular junction and so on, not actually in the blood. So people get cramps and stuff all the time, and they're, oh, is my sodium low? Well, no, on the blood test it's fine, but that's just not what's happening at the muscle. I'd have to do a biopsy, and which we don't do muscle biopsies in general practice, to really tell you what's actually going on. So these are perfectly fine. Not really anything to worry about there. Your creatinine 113 is ever so slightly elevated. Of course, you'll see it there just in red and bold above that 110. This is basically because you're going to be eating a lot of meat and a lot of creatine, and you've got some decent muscle.
Yeah. The doctor actually said to me, "Are you eating a lot of meat?" And I'm like, "Maybe."
So previously it was 102. It's now gone up to 113. So
Yeah.
I mean, you could potentially use that as a marker, and in fact, you might be eating less meat now,
Yeah, I am.
actually, which probably means you've actually increased your muscle mass.
It's good.
Which you probably have. I mean, looking at your Instagram, you probably have anyway.
Yeah.
But I'm good. I'm slowly getting there as well. So creatine is basically produced essentially creatinine is essentially produced from creatine phosphate in the muscle. The muscle is where we store that creatine phosphate, and it slowly kind of degrades into creatine essentially. Is the short story. So the more muscle mass we have, the more creatine we're likely to have anyway. So, and this is barely above the reference range. This is not a concern. Total bilirubin 21, not a huge concern. Probably some people just get it slightly higher when you fast. I don't know if this one was fasted or not. It doesn't tell me the previous test, but again, I wouldn't.
Yeah, they were
really
both
worry.
fasted.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about a fasting bilirubin of 21. It's really nothing to worry about at all. Albumin, everything again, but that's basically all pretty much completely normal. Where are we? CRP we've discussed, fasting insulin we've discussed, HbA1c we've discussed. And then I think the last thing is the white cells, the full blood count is the last thing on the list. People are probably getting a bit bored by now, so I'll try very quickly. So on the whole, look, these are fine. There's two key things that I'm looking at here. So one is the obvious thing in bold here. We'll come back to the MCV. That's the mean cell volume or mean corpuscular volume. And the monocytes here. So monocytes are one of your white blood cells, and these are an inflammatory white blood cell.
Okay.
I'll just highlight it here for people. And really what you want these to be basically relatively low. And optimal range is probably below 0.5, and you're 0.4.
Okay.
So again, in terms of inflammation, if we go back to that idea of building a picture, your CRP is less than 1, undetectable. Your monocyte levels are 0.4, basically very low. I'm very happy with this.
Mm.
And as a doctor, functional doctor, I'm happy with the monocytes of less than 0.5.
So why do you think that MCV is higher?
Well, interestingly, if we go back to the previous blood tests, the MCV was also elevated at 99. So again,
Okay.
it's actually
It's gone down.
Yeah, it's actually improved slightly. So 97 now. So things that can raise MCV, things like alcohol, if you're B12 deficient, if you're folate deficient, so that could be an issue. But again, you're not probably folate deficient overly. The other thing we did speak about earlier is this MTHFR and homocysteine. So if you do have an MTHFR gene mutation, this could increase your MCV. So it may be something that you may want to look at. It's about $50 for an MTHFR test, unless you've got a first degree relative who has MTHFR mutation themselves here in Australia for Medicare. It's probably not there, but without the homocysteine, I can't really give you that much advice on it. But that can raise the MCV. And essentially because the body's not methylating the folate properly, as well as B12 and B6, maybe B2 as well. And so it has a knock-on effect then on the rest of the body. And things like folate deficiency can raise the MCV. So a functional folate deficiency, if you've got an MTHFR mutation, could theoretically raise the MCV.
So the G6, I was going to say G6PD.
Playing a role here as well. Like I said, I'm not an expert in G6PD.
It's glucose 6-phosphate deficiency.
If I'd about that before, I should have done my homework and listened to the previous podcast. I could have pretended to be an expert in it. But it could be playing a role here. But again, it's got better. It's gone down, which I think is the key thing. Really interestingly, though, this is a really interesting one. Look at this. I can't highlight this one. Eosinophils 1.0. This is your previous blood test. Okay. This is your quote unquote allergic type white blood cell. Now it's 0.1.
What was it before?
1.0.
Oh, wow. It's a lot lower.
It's a 10th. So your eosinophils 1.0 is high. That's high for like even high. Yeah. That's telling me at that point you were having a pretty good going allergic issue or like immune kind of histamine issue.
Yeah.
And now, it's 0.1.
Wow. And that was taken when I was relatively healed as well.
Well, yeah, interesting. Again, I mean, like maybe it's just time. We can't say that carbs are doing that and so on. Maybe it's just time. Things have neutralized, normalized, and so on. But very, very interesting that is now completely normalized. Your basophils have gone from 0.1 down to undetectable, which generally is a good thing as well. Your white cells and everything are all pretty much absolutely fine there. We don't have your reticulocyte count. I mentioned that earlier. So RCC is just red cell count. It's not reticulocyte cell count. So we can't talk about HbA1c and reticulocytes, unfortunately.
Yeah. So white cell count is, all of those, sorry, my pronunciation, eosinophils, they're all like the inflammatory white cells.
So monocytes are like they're all part of the process, but monocytes are a bit more inflammatory response. Eosinophils are more of like an allergic type of response. So like your eczema and your skin conditions certainly could have been raising that. I think it's just an interesting observation that even on carnivore, essentially they were still pretty darn high. And now on animal based, they're really, really low. Now that may just be pure coincidence. Yeah, of course, and maybe just time
as well. Yeah,
exactly. But what's very interesting is pretty much most things have got better since your previous blood tests, and the exception maybe being the HDL down,
and triglycerides go
slightly up. Yeah. But again, if we kind of come back to this, this picture of health is very, very good. So the long story short, the picture is of very good health. And as a patient, if I had your blood results, I'd be very happy. As a doctor, if I had a patient with your blood results, I'd be very happy. And I would be saying, carry on. Basically, carry on. What you're doing is working, and it's obviously giving you great success. There's a couple of things that you could consider, as I mentioned, things like MTHFR testing, which is about $50. The methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, the homocysteine level, which Medicare will pay for. Just have to have someone to request it. The hemochromatosis gene assay, which is about $50, which you probably don't need, but you could consider that. T3, T4, you probably don't need that either, but again, you could consider it. All of these are about $50 though. And again, reverse T3, I think it's about $80. Someone got it the other day, a patient, and told me it was $80 odd. You probably don't need that either, to be perfectly honest. But if you're wanting like a really complete, kind of panel, adding those in would be useful. Things like LDL subfractions, again, it's about $125 to $185. You probably don't really need it. I wouldn't be pushing you to get this as a patient. If I was your doctor with this, I would be saying, look, just basically carry on. And the likelihood is that there's nothing to worry about here. at your age, again, 27, I wouldn't be usually recommending calcium scores and stuff for your heart. You could go and get one, of course, but I wouldn't be pushing a calcium score at your age. 40 plus, yeah, I'd be talking about calcium scores, but not really at your level, your age, sorry, and not with your results as well, because you're super low risk. And then just things like just other things you could check, like things like DHEAS, dehydroepiandrosterone sulfate, which is an androgen similar to testosterone, but we generally use it as a marker for chronic stress. And it's something that, again, is not overly useful in an absolute one-off, but as a monitoring. So I like to do DHEAS as an early one for people on these dietary changes, because then I can see how they're tracking and whether they're kind of putting more stress on their body or actually improving their stress on their body. And then things like cortisol and so on. But again, I mean, I probably wouldn't bother because your bloods are great.
Well, that's really great to hear. You had me in such anticipation. I wasn't sure what to expect. But,
worried. You really didn't need to be worried. Your bloods are really very, very, very good. And I really, I don't really have much more to add. The only other thing we didn't speak about, the ferritin, was copper. So you could look at copper. And copper is a very interesting one because it's very rarely checked by anybody. And even I don't often check copper that much. Copper deficiency is fairly common, but also so is copper excess. And most people also just have normal copper levels. So it's a funny one to check. And I don't usually check it. But if copper's out, iron can often be out as well, because copper's involved in the transferrin and iron, ferritin, and so on in a complex way. But if copper's quite low, then ferritin can go quite elevated.
There you go.
Increasing your copper, if you've already got good copper levels, is not likely to reduce your ferritin, though. So, it's a tough one. Where do we get copper? I mean, things like fruit, liver.
Liver's high in copper. Yeah.
I'm not sure there's a lot of copper in meat off the top of my head. I'd have to double check that. And things like seafood, fish, I'm not overly sure about that either off the top of my head. I don't do huge amounts of work in copper, so I'm not a copper expert. But if you're going to check copper, you also want to check ceruloplasmin as well. So anyone out there listening, that wants copper checked, they also need to check ceruloplasmin, because a one-off copper is not super useful. The copper and ceruloplasmin ratio is quite important. And again, off the top of my head, I'd have to double check. Pretty sure we want the ratio to be something like 6. So copper to ceruloplasmin, I think it should be somewhere around 6. I'll have to double check that, but people can do research anyway, but I don't often check it. So it's not immediately available off the top of my head, off the cuff.
Dr. Suresh, I'm so grateful.
But look, I mean, I've waffled on for ages. I've spoken way too much here, but I wanted to give you a nice full complete, kind of consultation.
Oh, it's amazing. And
your bloods are very good. You're very, very good.
The reason why I wanted to do this is purely because, in our previous podcast, you were talking about how Dr. Kinberry and Sean Baker's bloods don't look as good as they could be. And a lot of people like Dr. Anthony Shafee, and especially Professor Bart Kay, he's very vicious in his words to people who are on an animal-based diet. He even goes so far as to say Paul Saladino is irresponsible by sharing this information. And I think that's why I really wanted to share my blood, because I'm adopting basically the diet that Paul Saladino is recommending. And if my, HbA1c, fasting glucose, fasting insulin is fine, then it really flies in the face of I'm also 27, but it kind of flies in the face of what Anthony Shafee and Professor Bart Kay are saying.
Yeah. I think, again, I mean, for what, saying that Paul Saladino is irresponsible, I mean, I think I haven't heard him say that specifically.
I heard him say that in one of his interviews talking about the Randolph cycle. He was saying,
I think that's probably pushing it a little bit to say that. I mean, Paul Saladino, I don't necessarily agree with animal-based. For me, I've done it. It made me very fat, but that's because I just ate way too much. I don't think it was animal-based as such. I think it was just me and animal-based, if that makes sense. It just, the two things didn't align, basically. And I just ate way too much and, and so on. I could probably do it again and just rein it in a little bit. But I think to say that he's, um, kind of dangerous and so on. No, I mean, no, I don't agree with that. I mean, irresponsible. He puts out so much good information that whether or not you agree with carbs, I mean, most of what he talks about is nothing to do with carbs.
Mm.
It's just like wider aspects of health. And he's got so much good to say. And he has such good guests on his podcast that I think really, I mean, everyone should listen to it, carnivores and everyone else alike. Things like, again, carbohydrates and animal based. I mean, I spoke to someone the other day, a patient, and we were talking about doing carnivore versus animal based and so on. And I said, I looked at their, he's a big chap. He's tall. He actually is the one who got me into carnivore and so on in the first place. And he's, 100 and something kilos. And, he's pretty active and so on. And we went on the animal based website to look at the calculator for recommendation for carbs for him. And it was coming out at something like 125 to 140 grams of 100 to 125 grams of carbs a day for moderate activity level. I mean, that's borderline low carb. Low carb is generally 100 or less.
Yeah.
And in the research, low carb is generally up to about 25% of carbohydrates from calories, which if you're consuming, 2,500 calories a day, 25% of that is, I mean, let's just do some simple maths. What's 2,400? A quarter of that is 800. That's 200 grams of carbs, 4 grams per calorie, 4 calories per gram of carbs. That's 200 grams of carbs. An animal based, and that's still considered low carb in the research, not in the low carb community, but in the research. And then Paul Saladino, animal based, is recommending 100 to 150 for this guy who's 120 kilograms. Like, that's not even low. That's not even high carb. Like, that's still pretty low carb, and I don't think that he's doing people a disservice. I don't think he's, dangerous or irresponsible by talking about carbohydrates. And, again, I mentioned earlier, people like Walter Kempner and the rice diet, like there's more to this conversation. It's the right diet for the right person at the right time in their life with their lifestyle. There's no doubt there's one basis of a human diet. I mean, there couldn't not be. But, and Chafee's right, there's no animal on the planet that basically eats a different diet to, the rest of its species, particularly. But then you look at like bears or something, I mean, they'll eat pretty much anything. Like goats and stuff, they have a reputation for eating pretty much anything and everything that's put in front of them. They don't just stick to one particular diet. Human beings are built to be metabolically flexible, which means we can eat in different ways and be perfectly fine. And I think if animal-based is working for you and people like you, you're pretty active, you've got a decent muscle mass underneath it to kind of help to deal with that sugar, there's really no problem.
But you did say you said you put on weight when you were on animal-based, and you said you're now on a Primal Fusion, or?
Yeah, so Primal Fusion's my own kind of creation, which is somewhere in between a carnivore and animal-based diet. I mean, what I did was I took the kind of the good points of all of it and put it all together. Because people like Saladino, he obviously thought rightly or wrongly, he thought that carbs were needed. He saw a problem with a total absence of carbs. So then said, right, okay, well, carbs are needed, and I'm just gonna put in carbs because I need carbs.
Yeah.
And then he kind of says, well, ketosis, long-term ketosis is bad, therefore we shouldn't do ketosis. And then things like long-term fasting is bad, therefore we shouldn't do fasting. But I kind of feel like he's gone a little bit similar to the way some of the carnivores have gone, is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, well, long-term ketosis is bad, therefore never do ketosis. Well,
yeah,
there's a lot of benefit in short-term ketosis.
That's right.
There's a lot of benefit in short-term fasting, just not necessarily long-term fasting, or like overdoing fasting. The same thing with carbohydrates. There's potentially benefit in some carbohydrates, but maybe not for most people having high amounts of carbohydrates. So I kind of just look at this as from an analytical scientific perspective and say, well, if there's good points and there's bad points, like, why don't we just take out all the bad, leave in the good, find what works for people, and then just do that. And what I find working for me, And many people like me, because many people are like me, they're carb sensitive, are not able to work out loads, don't have huge amounts of muscle mass to burn all that glucose and so on as well. And so they struggle with a high carbohydrate diet, and then going to animal based might be an issue for them
Yeah.
because it's a higher carbohydrate diet. So the more kind of low carb ketogenic probably works well for them. But I also see people having issues with this long term ultra low carb. And I do see benefits in the occasional bump of carbohydrates. It helps to support things like thyroid, Randall cycle, and so on, keeps that machinery working, as I call it. And this is just what we see happening with some people. But how often? Like once a week, maybe bump up the carbs, and then that's it. Back down. You're back into ketosis in a day or two, if that. I mean, sometimes I can be back in ketosis the same day if I do a big workout, for example, burning off that glucose. And
so what's the biggest difference between primal? What's the biggest difference between primal fusion and animal based? Does it mean you incorporate more vegetables?
It's predominantly a ketogenic diet. It's predominantly low carb keto, with the occasional bump of carbohydrates, which people will naturally do on keto anyway. So, I mean, you could argue like I haven't really come up with anything new. No, I haven't. But no one's really come up with anything new in the diet space for like millennia anyway. Everyone's just rehashing other people's stuff. But what I've done is I've kind of just put it all together and said, look, I think this works for a lot of people, but I also think that Paul Saladino is onto something with the nutrition, because I see nutritional issues with carnivore. But how do we get the nutrition, which is mainly things like folate and vitamin C, without eating that much fruit? Because we don't necessarily want that much carbs for a lot of people. You have to go really high on the fruit to get things like the folate. There's not that much folate in fruit, believe it or not. It's mainly vegetables. So I use vegetables as a nutrition filler. So I'm not against vegetables necessarily, but I also don't recommend people eat them in huge amounts. I just say, to patients kind of like put your base in something like Chronometer or My Food Diary, My Fitness Pal, whatever, something like that. Put your base in. So if your base is steak, put your steak in, and then see where your RDAs are, and then fill the gaps, basically, however you want to fill them. And if that means eating like 45,000 carrots, well, fine, eat 45,000 carrots. Don't do that. You'll probably go orange. But you will actually go orange from beta carotene. Don't do that. But actually things like carrots are not that high in folate. So they're not actually that great as a filler vegetable. But I mean, you struggle with it obviously, but something like broccoli or avocado, you're fine with avocado. It's a really good filler. Okay, technically it's a fruit, of course, but it's a good filler. Things like mushrooms and so on. And again, to borrow from Dr. Anthony Chaffee, if food tastes really good for you, your body wants it. There's something in there that your body wants. And he says it's about beef and fat and butter and so on. Why does that not hold true for other things as well?
I love the taste of mushrooms and carrot.
I do, but not every day. If I haven't had them for like a month, like mushrooms taste like, oh my God, mushrooms taste like heaven to me.
Reminded me of like eating pizza. Like I remember those days.
Put a bit of cheese in it and some bacon. It's like, oh, loaded mushrooms is amazing. But they taste amazing to me. But then the next day they just taste like mushrooms. Like just, what's the point? It's nothing special. My body's obviously extracted something from that and said, thank God you finally got that. And now it's like, okay, I don't need it anymore. It's fine. So I don't see why the same principle can't apply to other foods as well. So I use vegetables and things basically as a filler. Put your base in, your meat, maybe a bit of fruit here and there, bit of dairy, whatever, some milk and so on. Get things like iodine from milk and so on. And then just put a bit of vegetables in to fill the gaps. And however you want to fill the gaps is perfectly fine. But I also talk about low toxicity vegetables because vegetables do have toxins. They are pretty high in plant toxins. This is very, very true. And this is something I did learn from the carnivore diet. Very, very true. And oxalates I see being one of the biggest issues, which is probably why people like Paul Saladino don't put in the vegetables, because he thinks this is a real issue. I think most of the toxins in vegetables outside of the oxalates are just not a huge deal for the most part. And maybe if you want that 1% absolute peak human perfection, fine. Maybe there's a better way.
I think for me, it's just the issue with legumes, especially, and brassicas being the glucosinolates, because I'm really sensitive to sulfur.
Yeah.
And the other
Enough
thing
room.
was,
There's
yeah,
gonna be, yeah.
yeah, and the other thing I was going to say is I'm eating a lot of fruit, so I've noticed I've put on weight. So I don't know if I'm eating too much and I should actually cut it back down to more of a primal fusion or intuitive eating kind of diet where I,
That's basically
less
what my
fruit.
Yeah, I mean that's basically what my primal fusion is. It's really just it's an intuitive eating. It's really listening to your body.
Mm.
I mean, we're talking about weight like fat
Oh,
or
no, no, it's just like,
muscle.
before I was very lean, like you could see the abs and everything, and I was a lot thinner. But now I've put on a bit of mass, so I'd say that's related to the carbohydrates.
Yeah, I mean maybe yes. For the most part, it's mostly just excess energy.
Yeah.
It's not. There's nothing really inherently fattening about carbohydrates, and people do say that they're really fattening, and they're not inherently fattening. Fat deposition is a multifactorial thing, and there's so many hormones that go into this. Again, coming back to things like LDL, and just one single thing is just like no, you can't just look at one single factor and say that's what causes everything. It just doesn't work like that.
Mm,
For the most part, body fat percentage, and so on, body composition is really around hormones plus the energy.
mm.
And if you have an energy excess, you're going to put on weight.
Mm.
Now, if
Because
you,
you said you put on a lot of weight on animal based.
I
That's what
did,
you said
I went
before.
crazy on the food.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. A caveat there was it was animal based with me, and I have had a lot of issues with sugar addiction in the past.
Mm,
And I can eat fruit perfectly fine now, and I can eat chocolate if I want to and not gorge on it. But I think that came from going through carnivore and then animal based, and then kind of out the other end of both of those. But I kind of just went a bit crazy on it, kind of fooled myself into thinking I was putting on loads, and I did put on muscle. Don't get me wrong, I did as well. But I also put on a lot of fat as well. And I
mm.
kind of fooled myself into thinking, nah, I'm just like I'm bulking up, and
Just from fruit, though.
No, well, I just gorged on food. Honestly, I probably went to like 3.5, 4,000 calories a day, and for like 2, 3 months, and my metabolic rate's probably not that great, which is probably why I have the issues with fat that I have or
Mm.
have had in the past. And I think I just overate,
But what
honestly.
type of food? Like fruits?
I just ate yeah, so I ate fruit, I ate dairy, I ate meat, of course, eggs, etc. I think it was probably the dairy I was overdoing. I was just drinking like a
Okay.
liter and a half of milk a day, and like
Yeah.
yeah, like I just went a bit overboard on everything. I think, to be honest, and part of me maybe was just I wanted to see what would happen.
Yeah.
Um, but because I think if you're someone that's kind of massively overeater, carnivore's probably better because
Yeah.
it is hard to overeat on carnivore.
Mm.
Um, I think you still can, but yes, overeating on carnivore is probably less fattening than overeating carbs. That much is
Yeah.
probably true. And there's going to be something about carbs that does that, but carbs by themselves are not inherently fattening as far as I'm
Mm.
concerned. I'm not sure there's any evidence to support that. And it's really about excess energy. And
Mm.
again, I mean, Paul Saladino is the obvious example. He's basically ripped, he's shredded, and he's
Mm.
eating almost 400 grams of carbs a day. There's
Yeah.
loads of bodybuilders out there that eat loads of carbs and they're shredded,
Mm.
and like they're pretty lean. Even in the off season, they're relatively lean, and and so on.
Mm.
So I think it's probably excess energy, and
Okay.
maybe it's just dial it back a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, Paul Saladino talks about how, he has patients who talk to him saying, "If I eat carbs, I won't be able to stop. I'll just keep on eating fruit." And then Paul Saladino says in response, "You can eat as much as you." This is his quote. Like I'm paraphrasing. He said, "You can
Yeah.
eat as much as you like, and it's your body wanting to fulfill that, like to be satiated to fulfill those nutritional needs. So maybe your body wants to eat this much." And so I don't know, I felt confused by that because I mean, I do eat a lot of fruit now, and if I start, I could, if I
Yeah.
didn't stop myself, I just keep eating.
It's an interesting point, and this comes back to satiety. and what is why do we eat? Why are we hungry? And I can eat like a kilo tomahawk and still be hungry. I'm physically full. My stomach's like bursting, and I look like I'm 9 months pregnant. But I am still hungry. Like my body's like, just go eat something, And I've always interpreted that as like I'm just a pig, and I just want to eat all the time. But I can eat like a couple of 100 grams of mince. I make like this keto burrito bowl with like some capsicum and some lettuce and some sour cream and avocado and stuff like that, and a bit of cheese and a bit of egg maybe in there as well, and some mince. I can eat a couple of bites of that, or like a bite of liver pate that I make at home, liver and heart and a bit of mushroom and onion and stuff like that, and I'm done. I'm not hungry at all.
Wow.
Versus like a kilo of tomahawk and I'm still hungry.
Is that satiety? Like, is this different nutrition?
Exactly.
Like, you're satisfying it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what drives satiety? Well, we don't really know, but this is where people like Ted Naiman, Dr. Einfeld, is it, I think, who came up with like Diet Doctor and stuff. They've been talking a lot about this on Twitter, X, about satiety. And people like Dr. Tro and stuff like that talk about it on Twitter as well. And Marty Kendall, I mentioned him earlier. He does a lot of work in satiety as well, and he talks a lot about this, nutrition, and it's this nutrient leverage hypothesis, nutrients versus calories, nutrient density, all these kinds of things. And the question is, what drives us to eat? Is it energy? Is it nutrients? Is it something else? Is it addiction? A lot of the time, it's nutrients, it's nutrition. And if you get that nutrition, very often you're just not really very hungry at all. You might get physically hungry a bit later because you actually need some energy, but what are you hungry for? Because I can sometimes just go and eat a spoon of honey and it has exactly the same effect. Now, there's not much nutrition in honey. It's just mostly sugar. It's energy. But obviously at that point, my body just wanted energy. So it's satisfied with just a bump in blood sugar or whatever it was it wanted.
But there was Paul Saladino talks about there's a lot of nutrients in honey. That's not just sugar.
A lot of it's arguable. I mean, there's some nutrients in honey, yes. I'm not sure there's as many as maybe Paul Saladino would like there to be, but I wouldn't say honey is a particularly good source of micronutrients, particularly compared to other foods out there, let's say anyway.
Yeah.
But this is where eating for nutrition, I think, is really important. And the drive, I think, that a lot of people get, some people, it will be genuine food addiction, just binge eating disorder. Some people, it will be sugar addiction, there's no doubt. A lot of people, though, I think it's probably, and for me, this is what I've worked out now in time, is it's nutrient seeking for me, mainly. And I've always interpreted that as like, oh, I just really like this, I want more. Because that's what my body's kind of telling me. But maybe I would be better suited eating something different. So let's just say my body wants, let's just throw out some made up numbers. Let's say my body wants 100 micrograms of folate and there's 10 micrograms in an apple and the apple tastes really good and I want more. I'm still hungry. I would need to probably eat 10 apples to get that same folate as maybe a tablespoon of avocado or half an avocado, for example. And then I'm done because all my body really wanted was folate. But I've just interpreted that as just keep eating apples.
Well, this is why I think intuitive eating is so important, because like when I'm looking at the options of food I have, you can tell, like, I don't really want to eat dates right now. I want to have a coconut or something. I want this because what you feel like eating is probably most likely your body craving the nutrient that you're lacking.
I think so. And there's actually good work. I can't remember the name now. Marty Kendall mentioned it in the interview. She did I think South African doctor, maybe pediatrician. She did work with kids, I think orphans, and basically, put them in front of all this food and basically, basically looked at what food the kids actually picked. And they had all this range of all the food. And they basically went straight to the thing that was highest in their biggest deficiency.
Wow.
And then they ate that till they were done. And then they went to the next highest deficiency.
That's
and then
great.
The next highest efficiency food. And these are kids with like no knowledge of anything. No one told them what to eat. And they just basically ate what the body kind of told them was the right thing to eat. absolutely fascinating work.
Yeah. Well, it's like the
And
miracle of animals, how they
really
manage to survive.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, they know what to eat basically. So I mean, what I personally have learned to do now is eat for nutrition and just almost sample like different things. So I don't have like 25 things on my plate, but I have like 4 or 5 things, and I don't just kind of eat excess of any one thing.
Mm.
And I've actually learned, rather than say, okay, I'm just going to eat all my steak first, which is the primary thing I'm eating, I'll actually just eat a bit of every part of the meal,
Mm.
because then my body will tell me, okay, now I'm just done. Like I don't need any
Mm.
one part of this meal anymore. I've had enough food. That's fine. I'll generally
Mm.
finish the steak because it's steak. I'm not going to let that go to waste. But
Yeah.
I've learned that that's really helping me. And I think a lot of overeating actually comes down to nutrition
Mm.
and nutritional seeking. I think maybe a good word for it.
Mm. And this is why I would like in the future to try and incorporate like carrots and mushrooms more into my diet and continue testing that to see how my body responds to it, because it didn't have as bad a reaction to say like potatoes or eggs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's tough when you've obviously got food intolerances, and but then now, like maybe now, you've maybe not got any more leaky gut, or because you probably,
Mm.
I'm no doubt you would have had leaky gut syndrome earlier on, and so on as well. And maybe you can get away with a little bit here and there.
Mm. I was curious to ask your opinion if I ever have like if I ever require antibiotics, will that mess up my microbiome so bad that I have to, like, I might develop leaky gut again?
It would affect it. There's no doubt. I'm not sure it would mess it up that badly. It does depend on the antibiotic, though. I mean, something like phenoxymethylpenicillin, for example, for tonsillitis or strep throat,
Mm.
is a relatively narrow spectrum antibiotic, which is why we give it.
Mm.
Which so it's less likely to affect other bacteria and so on in the body. Whereas something like ciprofloxacin, is like just like nuclear approach. It's just like kill everything basically,
Wow.
which is why we very rarely use it. And it's
Mm.
got high risk for things like Clostridium difficile, C. diff infections.
Mm.
One of these like hospital superbugs, because it just kills like all your microbiome, just basically dies. And then
Mm.
C. diff can just like run rampant and just multiply because there's nothing out competing it. There's nothing protecting you against it then. So not all antibiotics are the same when it comes to that. But that's why, again, we're taught in medicine, narrow spectrum, the right antibiotic for the right problem. Don't prescribe when you shouldn't be prescribing, and so on. And try and stick to those kind of, narrow spectrum ones where you can. That's going to just reduce the risk of these things happening. But things like probiotics, prebiotics, again, things like fruit, bit of fiber, soluble fiber, insoluble fiber, maybe a little bit there. Vegetables, and then probiotics. Again, I mean, the jury's out whether these are really very useful or not. But
Mm.
fermented foods, they're not bad. Things like kefir and so on. Kefir yogurt, kefir milk, and so on. Raw cheese, raw milk if you can get it. I mean, raw milk is pretty much the best microbiome support you can possibly get.
Yeah.
It's the closest, raw cow's milk is the closest thing we have. Most of us have access to rather than human breast milk,
Yeah.
and that's basically what builds the gut microbiome, or what should build the gut microbiome initially.
Mm.
Yeah, and raw cow's milk is the closest thing we have to it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Dr. Suresh, it's been amazing. I'm just so grateful, and hopefully people out there can use my good blood results to help them aid their decision to. I mean, if they want to adopt an animal-based diet, it might quench their any qualms they might have, and it might lead them in the right direction, perhaps.
I think people should look at your bloods and say, yes, these are good blood results. They are genuinely a good blood results. And like I said, I'd be happy to have them myself personally. I'd be happy if my patients had them, and very little for me to really, criticize or add a great deal to be perfectly honest. So Yeah, hopefully people have got value out of this. It has been an extra long episode today for 2 hours now.
Yeah.
I hope that has been okay with you there, Brad.
No, it's all good.
But
I
did
thank
you
you
have
for your time.
final questions for? Oh, look, you're very welcome. I could talk about this all day long. I really could. So, I'll let you go soon. Though, was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I just think it's been brilliant, and you know, it's a testament to you. But it's a shame not more doctors are open-minded and critical thinking like you, and can have conversations like this, because it's so rare, and it's difficult to even ask my general GP for these blood tests. It was difficult, and so it would be. It would be amazing if more doctors were like you, but it's also a testament to how unique you are.
Appreciate you saying that. And I mean, I just I try. I learn, I listen, and I read and research, and I'm just open minded, and I pick things up, and I agree. I mean, I wish more doctors were the same, but there are, I mean, the reasons. We spoke about Medicare quite a lot this evening. Of course, Americans will know Medicare, but their Medicare is different to ours. These are concerns, because people do get audited, and then they have to be able to justify the tests they're requesting. And, I mean, I know the research. I can justify homocysteine, I can justify CRP, I can justify testosterone levels. I can throw out all this research, for testosterone in men with depression risk and suicidality and, all these things. I can throw all that out easily if I get audited, but most doctors wouldn't be able to because they just don't know.
Yeah.
So that plays a role, but yeah, I wish more doctors were a bit more open-minded with it all, but I think, we're making waves. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Good time.
It's great. No, you and everyone like you are sending ripples out into the universe, and more people are becoming aware of this.
I think so. I mean, now I'm just another in a very long line of very, very, intelligent, very well-respected people who have come before me. I'm just riding their coattails, to be perfectly honest. But I'm trying to do what I can do to add to the conversation with my Primal Fusion diet, and just extending this conversation. So, but it's also people like yourself, Bradley, that have come on that are willing to, open the kind of book, so to speak, and show their results and talk openly and candidly and honestly about the pros and cons. And I think that is just so powerful. And I hope people will look at this, listen to this, and say, okay, well, this is just a really good conversation, and the ins and outs of it, and just don't kind of become dogmatic in any one particular area, and just kind of go with the flow a little bit more.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, I better let you go. Thank you guys
Thanks again
for listening. That's all right. Thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Meat Medic podcast. It has been a very long episode. If you have got to the end of it, I really appreciate it, of course. Like, comment, and subscribe, and all of that stuff. Make sure you follow Bradley over on his Instagram, Bradley Marshall Official. Got loads of followers now, like 70,000 almost.
Yeah.
I know. I need to get some of your followers. I'm doing terribly, but anyway,
I feel like you're doing really well on YouTube.
I'm doing all right on YouTube. Yeah, I don't really put enough content out on my social media, but I'm hoping at some point I can drop my hours at work and actually start to do some more of this work. But anyway, I'll let you go. Otherwise, we'll be here another hour.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Meat Medic podcast. And thank you again, Bradley, for coming on.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care.
Awesome.
Bye now.
Great. Bye.